Gunfire destroys their home in the middle of the night.
Fight or flight took over my body.
Somebody's just been shot. Somebody's outside screaming.
No one saw anything after the shooting.
The only piece of physical evidence they had was the shell casings.
In the hunt for the shooter, there's one immediate suspect.
There could only be one person who would want to put them in harm's way.
I would be crying in his face, and he would just sit there and just look cold.
He had videos of him and several subjects driving in the car, flashing gang signs.
But a shocking revelation will shake the very foundation of this case.
He would figure out one way or another where she was living.
He's over there on the ground.
Here you come like a Tasmanian devil, and you just turn everybody's world upside down.
It's okay, take a breath.
This is, the X from hell type scenario.
He just started shooting, so I grabbed my gun and shot back.
You did what you did, you continue to do it again.
At least you speechless.
It is crazy. His state of mind is frightening.
July 11th, 2020, Beaumont, Texas. It's a warm summer night in one of the nation's largest port cities.
Beaumont is located about 85 miles outside of Houston.
It is known for being that small town that a lot of blue-collar workers go to get jobs, to work in industrial plants and things of that sort.
It's just after midnight when Kayla Walker and her boyfriend, 24-year-old Clifford Jones, return to their North Beaumont apartment after a night out in downtown Houston.
Exhausted.
Me too.
We were relaxing in the house, just talking on the bed for the most part. And then there is where I heard gunshots. I didn't know where they were coming from.
The stunned couple bolts out of bed.
I guess fight or flight took over my body, and I got up and I was trying to look around and search the bedroom of what happened. Was it outside? Did it hit in here? Where did it hit at? Then I looked down at my foot, and I had a bullet wound that grazed my right foot next to my pinky toe. And then I saw Clifford, he was stumbling, and we went from the bedroom to the living room.
In the living room, Clifford starts to lose consciousness.
I was trying to help him. I didn't really know what to do. I was like, Clifford, please wake up, please wake up. And I could just see the color just leave his body. And at that moment, it's just the out-of-body experience that the human body does when something very traumatic like that happens. My body took over and went into overdrive, and I ran out the apartment screaming for help. I was like, Clifford's been shot. I don't know what to do. I'm in shock. I've been hit. Someone please call 911.
Somebody help!
At 24 years old, Clifford Earl Jones Jr. was a dependable and kind young man who stood out from his peers.
Clifford was the light of the world. He was a bright young man. He was funny, always laughing, playing.
He was a goofy, loving person. He didn't really have any problems with nobody.
Clifford spent a life trying to live righteously as a really nice, God-fearing person. He was an active member of his church.
We were rooted in Jesus. We all grew up in church.
And Clifford also spent time serving his country.
After graduating from high school, Clifford enlisted in the United States Marine Reserves. And he was such a focused young man. He set goals for himself, and he worked tirelessly to achieve them.
But after completing his contract with the Marine Corps, Clifford had a new goal.
He wanted to be a high school football coach because he eat, breathed, slept football.
Clifford was a football fanatic, played football in high school here.
As Clifford worked towards his new goal of becoming a football coach, he got some surprising news from a former girlfriend.
Child support papers came in the mail, and that's when Clifford found out about his son, Whitney.
Suddenly, Clifford was a father.
He was always I want to have kids. I want to have as many kids as I can. Being a dad was something that he did look forward to.
Coming into fatherhood was a blessing that filled Clifford with renewed purpose.
He loved being a father, spending time with Whitney when he was little.
He maintained a daily connection to his son.
I think it gave him a piece of fulfillment to be able to pour into somebody.
To help provide for his son, Clifford put his dream of becoming a football coach on hold and took the first job he could find, unaware it would lead to much more.
Me and Clifford met at a fast food joint that we worked at. We were working there during the COVID pandemic, and from there, our relationship kind of flourished.
She was in school, she had stuff going, and, at that point in time, that was something good for him.
His sense of humor, his ability to just give unconditional care is really what struck me and attracted me to him.
We kept progressing, and I could really tell that he really liked her. He's serious.
He was like, honestly, I'm in love with you. And I kind of told him the same, that I did love him too. And he was really my angel on this earth.
After just over a month of dating, Clifford moved into Kayla's apartment, and the two started planning a future together.
He was explaining that he wants to go back to school, that way he can get his bachelor's in kinesiology. We wanted children, we wanted to get married, we wanted a life together. We wanted to explore life together.
But now, instead of chasing their goals, Clifford and Kayla have both been shot by an unknown gunman.
I ran out the apartment, screaming for help. I've been hit. Someone please call 911.
Somebody help! Help!
Beaumont police received multiple phone calls from neighbors in other areas where they had heard these loud bangs and were greatly concerned.
Police dispatch, how can I help you? Somebody's just been shot. Somebody's outside screaming.
I live at Jefferson Housing Apartment. I hear people screaming down the stairs saying somebody got shot.
The police were there with under a minute, very fast. And then the paramedics had came, and I was just distraught. I mean, I couldn't even think about what happened or why it happened. I was just in pure shock.
Officers take Kayla aside as paramedics try to revive Clifford.
I'm just in a sense of, is he okay? What's gonna happen?
They realized that Clifford's body was unresponsive. Clifford Jones is dead.
At 24 years old, Clifford Jones was a kind young man respected by his peers and had begun building a life with his girlfriend, 22-year-old Kayla Walker.
We expressed to each other that we're each other's soulmates and we're in this together.
He was a cool guy, he was a great dad, and it was really good to see it, like him, moving in that direction with Kayla.
But around 1 a.m. on July 11th, 2020, Clifford has been pronounced dead after a shooting at the apartment he shared with Kayla.
He was shot up here through essentially the collarbone and traveled into his chest. And that's what actually killed him.
I was trying to be strong, but I was really feeling my emotions. I was angry and sad at the same time because I knew that he didn't deserve that. And that's just not fair. We're each other's soulmates and we're in this together, and we just needed the platform to execute that, but we didn't get that chance.
Kayla has also suffered a gunshot wound to the foot.
I never went to the hospital. The police, the paramedics, they just wrapped my foot up, and I went straight to the police station to be interviewed.
Shortly thereafter, homicide detectives arrived to begin their investigation.
I gathered all my equipment and headed out to the scene. At that point, we went ahead and videoed the whole scene.
Outside of the couple's apartment, they spotted several 9mm shell casings all over the ground.
And they had located 4 bullet entries into the window of a bedroom in the apartment complex.
Inside the bedroom, detectives continue their investigation.
What they discovered were that there were several bullets that were lodged into the wall.
We started looking at the trajectory of the rounds and trying to figure out where the subject was standing in the parking lot when they started shooting. We checked the whole apartment complex. We looked for videos. We were looking for anything we could find.
Unfortunately, the apartment complex isn't equipped with surveillance cameras.
And the way this apartment complex is set up, even if there was Ring doorbell cameras, which we were looking for, they would face the inner part of the complex.
So they began to do some major footwork. They went door to door and were talking to neighbors.
But no one saw anybody leaving or anything after the shooting.
Leaving the scene with zero answers makes detectives' next step even more difficult. Notifying Clifford's family.
I'm like, my child is really dead? So I bust out crying.
My heart just, it felt like everything around me just came to a halt.
At this point, we had no leads at all.
All they knew was that somebody shot into the window and there was a whole lot of question marks.
Do you have any idea who may have done this?
No. They asked us who would want to kill Clifford. I said, sir, my child didn't bother anybody.
He got along with everybody.
CJ was always kind-hearted. If he had something to give, he would give it.
Who would want to kill him was the million-dollar question.
Detectives hope Clifford's girlfriend, Kayla Walker, can help them answer that question.
They had to go back to Kayla to get some type of answers.
Right there in the chair. I'm gonna put it back.
I was fully cooperative because at that point, I really didn't know what was going on. Like, I just knew that my boyfriend, someone that I really cared about, was dead at that point for no reason.
Detectives asked Kayla to walk them through what happened.
We get to the house around 12 o'clock. And I had turned the light off. We had a conversation. He was just telling me how much he loves me. I was telling him about my body image, about how I don't like the way I look and stuff like that. And he was just like, oh, you know, you're so beautiful. I love you. It doesn't matter.
Kayla says that's when gunshots rang out.
I didn't know where they were coming from. I just know Clifford's last words were, they're shooting outside.
I realized I'm dead. I'm like, oh. And I looked and saw his bullet wounds, and I was freaking out.
She says she did not get a good look at the shooter since they fired from outside of the apartment.
Did y'all have any issues with anybody today at all? Do you know if he's having any issues with anybody?
He's not. He's very transparent.
Kayla also backed what Clifford's family had said. Clifford had no known enemies.
But Kayla reveals there may be one person who had a motive to target Clifford.
I think it's my ex-boyfriend. I don't think he did it, but I think he hired someone to do it.
Kayla says she and her ex-boyfriend, Malcolm Ward, broke up in April, 1 month before she started dating Clifford.
You know where he lives?
Not currently.
Where did he live before?
With me.
Oh, so in the apartment you're in right now?
Yes, his name is on the lease still.
Kayla says during their time together, the relationship was rife with issues.
What kind of issues did y'all have?
He was more so emotionally abusive to me in the sense that he would just be cold. I would be crying in his face, telling him, I really love you, I can't be without you. He would just sit there and just look cold.
She told the investigators that when she ended the relationship, he did not take the news very well.
Was he mad at you? I mean...
He was mad at me.
Kayla tells detectives that her ex-boyfriend Malcolm had trouble with the fact that she had moved on into a new relationship.
She said that he was always real possessive and he would harass her, follow her around after they broke up.
He just couldn't let her go.
But did Malcolm's jealousy consume him to the point of violence?
He's the only other person that know I live there, except for my sorority sisters and other of my close friends, and none of them would like set me up like that, let alone want to try to kill me.
After beloved father and U.S. Marine veteran Clifford Jones is shot to death, detectives are left scrambling for leads. But now, his girlfriend, Kayla Walker, believes there's one possible suspect: her ex-boyfriend, Malcolm Ward.
We didn't end our relationship well, so the only person that I could think of in that moment that may have had an issue with me would be my ex.
He's the only other person I know I live there, except for my sorority sisters and other of my close friends, and none of them would like set me up like that, let alone want to try to kill me.
He would come through the drive-thru and work harassing her and questioning her about Clifford.
She said that his behavior became so erratic that it was starting to make her very uncomfortable.
When you have breakups, it brings out, a personal side to people. And they get emotional in it, and they start acting and doing things that they would normally do. And the violence can increase like a stepladder.
And I don't even point the blame game at anyone, but the only other person that I have a problem with is my ex.
With all the previous accusations she had given us, it seemed like that was the direction that we needed to focus on.
When investigators start looking into Kayla's ex, Malcolm, they discover alarming information that adds to their suspicions.
We started checking his social media accounts, and in fact, he had been posting what appeared to be a 9mm pistol on several images. He had videos of him and several subjects driving in the car, flashing gang signs, and displaying pistols.
But that's not the only disturbing detail detectives uncover.
They look into his records and see that he was a suspect in unrelated murder charges.
He had a lengthy criminal record of weapon charges and some ag assaults, so it concerned us.
Now, investigators have a new theory as to what happened the night of Clifford Jones' murder.
Investigators determined that Malcolm must have drove from Houston to Beaumont to stalk Kayla and Clifford that night.
And when he overheard them in bed together, he shot through their window in a jealous rage.
He was mad at the situation. It was a crime of passion to us.
Based on their growing suspicions, detectives reach out to Malcolm.
We asked him if he'd come in and give us an interview.
But when he comes to the police station, he is not alone.
He brings his attorney. And Malcolm's attorney is not just his attorney, it's also his sister.
Where were you last night, Malcolm?
He was with me.
When we started kind of getting more detailed about his movements, the days prior, she started answering for him.
She tells the police officers that he was with her, so there's no way he could have been there the night of the crime.
Now she's not only trying to be his lawyer, but also his alibi.
That's when we stopped the interview and said, hang on a minute, you can't be his legal counsel and his alibi. It was a conflict of interest.
I'm gonna go make a phone call. I'll be right back.
We realized that she had just graduated law school 6-8 months prior, and she was actually a civil attorney.
Oh, really?
I called the law firm that she worked with, and it didn't go well for her.
She's not even qualified to represent her brother in a criminal case.
At that point, they left and never came back.
While Malcolm hasn't incriminated himself, the unorthodox interview leaves detectives feeling encouraged.
So they do some more research and they subpoena his phone call records.
But when the results come in, they're not what police expected.
We didn't see his cell phone anywhere near the crime scene.
Instead, his phone was active in Houston at the time the shooting occurred, which was 80 miles out of Beaumont.
The phone records clear Malcolm Ward of any wrongdoing in this case.
Detectives have no choice but to cross Malcolm off their list. Now they're back at square one.
They followed all the leads that they had, came up to a dead end. They did all the investigating that they could do. Nothing.
Even though I was cooperative with the police and gave them everything that I could have possibly thought of, it still was never enough.
By the time Clifford's funeral takes place, his family is still desperate for answers.
It was very hard to see him laying there, and I'm like, my baby is gone, and I don't know who did it and why.
They asked me to be the pallbearer. It was tough, discouraging. I don't know how else to put it. It was heartbreaking.
The only thing I wanted in that moment was his family and friends to get justice.
In the days that follow, Clifford's advocates turned to the media for help tracking down his killer.
We did a press release reaching out to the media, hoping that this would trigger some more talking and people would start calling again.
He said, we're going to need you to do a press conference. So the press conference was held, I think, September 13th. It was hard to do that.
Unfortunately, their heartfelt pleas go unanswered.
Nobody was calling. We weren't getting any further traction on any leads at all.
It looked pretty slim of a chance of finding out who was responsible for the murder of Clifford Jones.
Then, on October 25th, there's a sudden break in the case.
I'd gotten a call in reference to a shootout at a major intersection in our city.
It's at the same complex Clifford and Kayla had been living when they were shot.
We'll be right there.
I saw it on Facebook, and I kind of looked at it like, something's not right, because that would never happen over there twice.
For investigators, this is too much of a coincidence. They immediately think that these two crimes could be related.
Hey, he's down.
After months of dead ends in the murder investigation of 24-year-old Clifford Jones, Beaumont detectives suddenly have a new lead to follow.
We'll be right there.
A Beaumont officer responded to a call of a burglary in progress in Clifford's old apartments.
But when officers drove up, they actually saw two men in the apartment parking lot shooting at each other. And one of them ran across the street and collapsed, and the other one ran off.
Hey, he's down. Another suspect ran this way.
They are able to identify the victim as a man named Marcus Taylor.
He was in pretty bad shape. The bullet had nicked many vital organs as it had gone through.
Once Marcus is rushed to the hospital, officers get to work tracking down the other man involved in the shootout.
The other guy took off that way wearing like a gray hoodie.
They set up a perimeter so we can try to detain the other guy that took off running. And they started searching.
Some guy just said he went trying to get up into an apartment upstairs, but then he ran downstairs.
There's no sign of him anywhere.
Thankfully, though, a key witness calls down from an upstairs apartment.
Somebody gonna come speak with me? Speak with who? Are you the original caller? Okay, yes, yeah.
The young woman identifies herself as 21-year-old Imani White.
She said she was the one who made the initial 911 call.
She says the victim, Marcus Taylor, is her boyfriend.
And she knows who shot him.
She identifies the man in the gray hoodie as 22-year-old Jeroy Zachary, the father of her child.
And,
It's okay. Take a breath. Take a deep breath.
okay. Yes,
You can sit down if you want.
okay.
She had been dealing with her child's father, Mr. Zachary, pretty repeatedly.
They had a tumultuous relationship that ended, and Jeroy didn't take it well.
She moved out with her son, but he would figure out one way or another where she was living, and he would show up.
That lead on to burglary or criminal mischief where he's busting windshields and glass on her car, to terroristic threats.
Because, like I said, we had this issue before and called the cops and stuff.
Earlier this morning, Imani says she and her new boyfriend Marcus had been awoken by a strange noise.
What was that?
I was like, did you hear that noise? And I told him it sounded like somebody was throwing something out the window.
They went to the window to see what was going on. And upon further investigation, they were able to see her ex-boyfriend snooping around Marcus's car.
You better not mess with my car.
I think he's about to leave.
They had saw him leave, and thinking that he was gone, her boyfriend walked outside.
He went to go and check on his truck, and I guess he was hiding somewhere. He ran out.
But a few moments after, she can hear gunfire outside of the apartment.
There's no doubt in Imani's mind. Jeroy had been waiting to ambush Marcus, and investigators agree with her.
All right. If you need something, we'll be right outside, right downstairs. Okay.
Given Imani's statement, investigators' new focus is tracking down Jeroy Zachary.
Every time a gunshot victim shows up at the hospital, they have to notify the police department.
Before they can put out a BOLO alert, they receive notification that he went to the hospital.
Although Jeroy has gunshot wounds to his arm and elbow, he's in stable condition and ready to talk.
We interviewed him there in the hospital.
Jeroy says all he wanted was to see his son.
I haven't seen my son about 3 months, sir. And I'm paying child support. So today I'm hard. So I just got a little rock to get the attention out of this, so they come outside.
When he saw that didn't work, he decided to leave. But as he was walking away, he saw Imani's boyfriend, Marcus, leave the apartment.
I was like, hey, you can tell my baby mom not talk to my son, ain't talked to him in some months.
But before anything else can happen, he claims that Marcus pulled out a gun.
Well, he started shooting, so I grabbed my gun and shot back.
He leveled out on him.
He grabbed the gun and shot me. So I grabbed my gun and shot him.
He says he was panicking and worried that police officers would try to pin a case on him.
I don't know, I just shot somebody.
So you felt guilty
about shooting him because he shot me. I don't want no charge.
Now, what if
no murder charge?
Detectives take Jeroy's story with a grain of salt.
It doesn't make sense for somebody to say, hey man, let me see my baby, and then someone else starts shooting.
That's all that happened.
That don't make sense.
Even while confessing, he wasn't particularly forthcoming. He was trying to minimize what he had done and make excuses.
Unfortunately, Marcus Taylor is unconscious at the hospital due to the gunshot wounds he suffered at the hands of Jeroy. So investigators aren't able to get his side of the story.
And detectives continue to suspect Marcus isn't Jeroy's only victim.
They believe he had something to do with the shooting that claimed the life of Clifford Jones.
I start looking at the time frames of how this happened.
They discover that 1 month after Clifford was killed, Jeroy was stalking Imani's apartment.
Jeroy says the last time he was at Imani's was a few weeks ago. But when they look into it, he was there in August and had reports involving Imani since 2019.
There are multiple recordings from Imani's Ring camera that show Jeroy arriving unannounced and banging on her door or attempting to vandalize the camera.
And when investigators compare the shell casings from Marcus's shooting to those from Clifford's, the connection is undeniable.
They come back and said, we have a match.
The same gun that was used in the shooting of Marcus Taylor was used in the murder of Clifford Jones.
Three months after Clifford Jones was murdered inside his Beaumont apartment, a similar shooting has led detectives to place Jeroy Zachary as the prime suspect in both attacks.
The National Integrated Ballistic Information Network was able to match these two shell casings together.
The gun used on the ag assault is the gun that was used on my homicide.
As more information is coming in with this case, investigators are able to craft a new theory as to how Clifford Jones was murdered.
They believe Jeroy came to the apartment complex on the night of July 11th, seeking revenge against his ex, Imani White.
Imani and Marcus lived in the apartment unit directly above Kayla and Clifford.
He thought his ex lived at the bottom of the apartment, but she lived at the top.
When he heard Kayla and Clifford inside their apartment, he thought it was Imani and Marcus.
And he became so enraged that he fired shots into the apartment. This was a case of mistaken identity.
In the following days, detectives believe Geroy discovered his mistake and returned to finish the job.
This man who is dealing with anger, jealousy, and rage clearly has been able to zone in on his desire to hurt someone. He wanted to hurt Imani, he wanted to hurt Marcus, and unfortunately, he did hurt them.
Now, detectives bring Geroy in from county jail for a second interview.
Ultimately, we need to get him to confess to a murder, right? So it was important to get him to nail down that that gun was his, and he had not let anyone else use that gun. No one else messed with it?
No,
it's yours?
It's mine.
Okay, you wouldn't let someone else have that, right?
No, sir.
But you keep that gun on you all the time?
Yes, sir.
That gun had never been in anyone else's possession.
Without directly saying it, Geroy has now admitted that he's the only one who could have shot Clifford on July 11th.
Now, detectives push Geroy for a confession.
I explained to him that this was going to be one of the more important conversations he'd have in his life. Take a minute and think about the things that I've said, okay, buddy?
Detective Coffin asked him, "Did you have anything to do with that shooting in July?" And he said, "Yes."
He quickly then said that he is the one that killed Clifford Jones.
The fact that someone had that much rage, I just didn't know someone could have that much hate in their heart.
Clifford was killed because of mistaken identity. And my heart just broke into a million pieces, like my child was killed for nothing.
Geroy says after the deed was done, he drove back to Houston. He didn't realize he'd shot into the wrong home until later.
Do you know the person you killed? You do? How did you know it?
I went to school and I was cool with everybody. I was one of my friends in high school and let everybody laugh.
The dude was his classmate, played on the football team with him.
I'm still burning to this day.
But instead of coming forward and admitting what he did, he allowed Clifford's family to suffer with the uncertainty of not knowing what happened.
Did you tell anybody what you did?
No, sir.
No, any friends or?
Nobody.
You never confided in anyone?
No, it's my son.
With all loose ends accounted for, detectives are finally able to charge Geroy with Clifford Jones' murder.
I was relieved that we finally had a name and face on who killed Clifford, but it was just mind-blowing.
It was a big sigh of relief to know that the person who did this senseless act was no longer going to be able to hurt anybody else.
With the evidence in hand, the prosecution expects this case to be open and shut. But at trial, Geroy flips the script.
He pled not guilty even after the confession.
He just really thought it was a game.
In January of 2021, Geroy Zachary finally faces a jury for the capital murder of beloved 24-year-old father, Clifford Jones.
It was very hard to sit there and see him face to face because he just really thought it was a game.
Even though Geroy confessed to police, he decides to plead not guilty at trial.
In another surprising move, Geroy takes the stand in his own defense.
They essentially tried to portray him as a victim and that this long history of violence was not his true nature.
He states that he had no intentions of murdering Clifford as well as hurting anybody. He says that he simply wants to be a good father and see his son.
He never showed any remorse for what he did at all. None. He never took accountability.
It really turned to he's not this monster that he really is. And I think they were hoping to maybe get some sympathy.
Despite Jeroy's new strategy, the prosecution holds firm in the argument they've built.
Because these cases are intrinsically linked, I made sure that we covered our bases. And I started with Kayla.
Standing trial and getting to say what happened to me was the first time I ever got to talk about what happened. And it was different because I had to go into real deep details in front of a jury and witnesses and Clifford's family and the defendant's family as well. And it was definitely an uncomfortable situation.
Kayla is forced to come face to face with the man that terrorized her and Clifford.
The attorney said, "Do you know who this person is?" And I said, "I'd never seen that man in my life."
And I let her tell her story, that this innocent young woman just had her life shattered one night while she was with her man, with Clifford.
We were living life to the best of our abilities. Clean records, no crazy things or anything of that nature, but our lives were changed forever.
It's crazy because Clifford was where he wanted to be, minding his business, and his life was taken because someone was mad and in their feelings and shot it to the wrong apartment.
While Jeroy claims he didn't intend to kill Clifford, prosecutors say it doesn't absolve him of murder.
He was well aware of what he was doing, that he shouldn't be doing it, but he insisted on doing it anyway.
And he wasn't stopping. It progressively got worse to the point where he walks outside on October the 25th and opens fire.
You did what you did, you continue to do it again.
Prosecutors point out that Jeroy also put his own son at risk.
He was firing shots into random apartments. One of those bullets could have easily hit his son that he so desperately loves and tries to protect.
You love your son so much that you would actually take a loaded gun and shoot it into the apartment that your child is living in, really?
It is crazy. His state of mind is frightening.
It leaves you speechless, and it's like, you really did this. You did this.
After just half an hour of deliberation, the jury returns with a verdict.
I don't think the jury felt any sympathy for him.
Jeroy Zachary is found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to 70 years in prison. He'll be 92 when he gets out, so it's essentially a life sentence.
After Jeroy is sentenced for Clifford Jones' murder, Marcus Taylor passes away.
He continued having medical complications after being shot by Jeroy, and his loved ones believe that's what killed him.
Jeroy has been charged with aggravated assault for the attack on Marcus.
Those charges are still pending, so Jeroy could actually end up seeing more time added to his sentence once that case is resolved.
But for Clifford Jones' loved ones, it still wouldn't be enough.
I feel like it's not enough. For me, I feel like death should be treated with death.
Both families ultimately in the trial process lost. We were separate on each side, but we were in pain together.
In a senseless act of violence, Clifford Jones lost his life due to the reckless behavior of a man he barely knew.
These are the things of just the X from hell type scenario.
Here you come like a Tasmanian devil, and you just turn everybody's world upside down. And that's the hurtful part, that Clifford should still be here.
He wasn't doing nothing to anybody. He was where he was supposed to be.
This is very unfair. I lost somebody that I really cherished. His family lost a loving person. His child is growing up without his father on this earth.
On a cold October afternoon in 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessup walked home from school in Queensville, Ontario, and disappeared. She was supposed to be safe. She was a child walking through a small rural community where people knew one another, where familiar roads connected farms and homes, where a trip home from school should have been routine. Instead, Christine never reached her house. Within hours, a search began. Within days, the case had become a national nightmare, and within months, the investigation would produce a suspect, a conviction, and one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. But the real killer remained free. For decades, the truth stayed buried beneath a mountain of unanswered questions, conflicting evidence, investigative mistakes, and a criminal justice system struggling to understand forensic science that was still in its infancy. Christine Jessup was 9 years old when she vanished on October 3rd, SIL, 1984. She had been walking home from school in Queensville, a small community north of Toronto. Her disappearance immediately triggered a desperate search. Family members, neighbors, police officers, and volunteers searched the surrounding area, hoping to find the little girl alive. But the hours passed. Then the day, and the possibility everyone feared became reality. Christine's body was discovered 3 months later, on December 31st, SIL 1984, in a wooded area near Queensville. She had been murdered. The discovery transformed the investigation. A missing child had become a homicide victim, and detectives now faced a question that would haunt the case for decades. Who had taken Christine, and why? At the time, investigators did not have the forensic tools that modern homicide detectives take for granted. DNA profiling was not yet part of ordinary Canadian criminal investigation. The technology that would eventually transform cold cases had not reached the courtroom. Biological evidence could be collected, but its power to identify an unknown offender was still years away. Christine's death therefore became a battle of traditional police work, witness statements, physical evidence, and investigative judgment. One of the people who came under suspicion was a man named Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived in the same general area and was a neighbor of the Jessup family. He became a focus of the investigation, and his life changed forever. What followed would become one of the clearest examples of how an investigation can move in the wrong direction when suspicion begins to replace proof. Morin was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. He denied involvement. The case against him would eventually collapse, but not before he endured years of suspicion, imprisonment, and public judgment. The first trial ended with an acquittal in 1986, but prosecutors appealed, and Morin was ultimately convicted at a second trial in 1992. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. By then, the case had become a national controversy. Morin continued to maintain his innocence. His family continued to fight for him, and the evidence that would eventually establish his innocence was already sitting inside the case file, waiting for a scientific breakthrough. DNA technology arrived in Canadian criminal courts in the late 1980s, and the country's national DNA databank was not established until 2000. The RCMP notes that DNA evidence was first permitted in a Canadian courtroom in 1989, illustrating just how primitive forensic identification had been when Christine was killed in 1984. The timing mattered. Christina's murder occurred before DNA profiling could provide the kind of definitive genetic identification that investigators would later use to solve cold cases. The science simply was not ready. But when DNA testing became available, the evidence from Christine's case could finally be examined in a new way. Testing ultimately established that biological evidence associated with Christine's clothing did not belong to Morin. It belonged to another man. The revelation was catastrophic. It meant the man who had spent years being treated as Christine's killer was innocent. The conviction was overturned, and Morin was exonerated. But the story did not end there. In fact, the exoneration created an even more disturbing question. If Guy Paul Morin had not killed Christine Jessup, then who had? The DNA profile belonged to an unknown male. For investigators, the case had entered a new and terrifying phase. They knew the genetic signature of the man connected to Christine, but they did not know his name. There was no immediate database hit. The profile existed, but it pointed into darkness. The case became a genuine cold case. Years passed. Christine's family continued living with the pain of her death and the knowledge that the person responsible had never been identified. Morin had been cleared, but clearing an innocent man did not automatically solve the murder. In fact, it exposed how badly the original investigation had failed. The focus on Morin had consumed enormous investigative energy, while the real offender remained unidentified. The DNA evidence now offered a second chance, but second chances in cold cases can take decades. The unknown profile was preserved. Investigators continued to examine the evidence. New techniques emerged. Genetic genealogy began transforming forensic investigations around the world. Instead of requiring an offender's DNA to already exist inside a criminal database, investigators could sometimes search publicly available genetic genealogy resources for relatives of an unknown person. A distant cousin could become the first thread. That thread could lead to a family. The family could reveal a surname, and eventually traditional police work could narrow the possibilities to a specific individual. It was this emerging technology that finally changed Christine Jessupa's case. More than 35 years after her murder, investigators returned to the genetic evidence. The unknown male DNA profile was examined through genetic genealogy. The process eventually pointed investigators toward a man named Calvin Hoover. Hoover was not a stranger to the historical investigation. He had lived in the area around the time Christine was murdered, but by the time investigators identified him through the genealogical process, he was dead. That created another extraordinary problem. The man who appeared to be connected to Christine's murder could not be interviewed, arrested, or confronted. He could not explain himself. He could not deny the allegation. He could not tell investigators what had happened. The case would have to be built almost entirely from the evidence he had left behind. In 2020, the Toronto Police Service announced that DNA evidence had identified Hoover as the person whose genetic profile matched the biological evidence from Christine Jessupa's clothing. The announcement brought a stunning end to one of Canada's most notorious cold cases. After 36 years, investigators finally had a name. But the announcement carried another painful reality. There would be no courtroom trial. Hoover had died in 2015. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. Yet identification still mattered. For Christine's family, knowing who had been responsible answered a question that had haunted them since 1984. For Guy Paul Morin, it represented the final confirmation that the conviction against him had been profoundly wrong. And for Canadian law enforcement, the case became a powerful demonstration of what modern forensic genealogy could accomplish. The DNA had existed for decades. What changed was the ability to interpret it. The science had finally caught up with the evidence. The contrast was almost surreal. In 1984, investigators had a murdered child and an unidentified killer. In 1992, an innocent man was imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. In the years that followed, DNA testing exposed the error. Then, decades later, genetic genealogy transformed an anonymous biological profile into the name Calvin Hoover. One case had crossed multiple generations of forensic science. The investigation had moved from fingerprints and witness statements to DNA profiling, then from conventional DNA databases to genealogical research. Every stage depended on evidence preserved during the previous stage. The same biological material that could not identify anyone in 1984 eventually became the key to identifying the real offender. That is what makes Christine Jessupa's murder so haunting. The evidence had been there. The truth had been there. But the technology needed to reveal it did not exist when the crime occurred. And while investigators searched for answers, an innocent man suffered the consequences of a system desperate to solve the murder. Guy Paul Morin's name became inseparable from the tragedy, but not because he was guilty. His case became a symbol of wrongful conviction. Christine's murder became a symbol of an unsolved crime, and the DNA profile became the bridge between the two. When police finally announced that Calvin Hoover had been identified as the man whose DNA was found on Christina's clothing, the news reverberated across Canada. The case that had begun with the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl had finally reached its most important forensic conclusion. But even then, the word solved could never fully describe what had happened. Christine was still dead. Her family had still endured decades of grief. Morin had still lost years of his life, and Hoover could never stand before a jury. The truth had arrived, but it had arrived impossibly late. There was no dramatic courtroom verdict, no jury deliberation, no sentence. Instead, There was a name attached to a DNA profile and the knowledge that the person responsible had escaped legal accountability through the passage of time and death. For Christine's family, however, the identification mattered. The mystery surrounding the killer had finally ended. The question that had haunted them for more than 3 decades had an answer, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of the story. For years, people had wondered whether Christine's killer was still alive, whether he might be watching the investigation, whether he might have been living quietly somewhere in the community. In the end, the answer was hidden, not in a confession, not in a forgotten witness, and not in a dramatic police confrontation. It was hidden inside a microscopic biological trace, a trace left behind in 1984, a trace that survived the collapse of one investigation, the wrongful conviction of an innocent man, the rise of DNA science, and the passage of more than 3 decades. It waited. And when investigators finally had the technology to read it, it told them the truth. The little girl who walked home from school in Queensville had not simply vanished into history. Her case had remained alive inside the evidence, and after 36 years of silence, that evidence finally spoke her killeress name. The case against Guy Paul Morin did not begin with a confession, a fingerprint, or a witness who had seen him murder Christine Jessup. It began with suspicion. That distinction would become one of the most important facts in the entire story. On October 3rd, still 1984, Christine disappeared from the small Ontario community where she lived, and within months, investigators had focused on the man who lived next door. Morin was considered strange by some people around him. He was different. He kept bees. He played the clarinet and saxophone. He worked as a finishing sand. He helped his father renovate their home. None of those things made him a murderer. But as the investigation progressed, ordinary details of his life began to be interpreted through the assumption that he was guilty. The danger was already taking shape. Once investigators began viewing Morin as the likely killer, information that supported that theory seemed increasingly important, while information pointing away from him risked being dismissed. Years later, the Kaufman Inquiry would describe this phenomenon as tunnel vision, a narrow focus on one investigative theory that distorts how evidence is evaluated. In Christina's case, that tunnel vision would help turn an innocent neighbor into the accused killer of a 9-year-old girl. But in October 1984, nobody knew how badly the investigation would eventually fail. Christine had simply disappeared. She had been dropped off by the school bus near her home. Her parents returned later and discovered that she was not there. Her school bag was inside the house, but Christine was missing. The search began. Neighbors looked around the area. Police searched roads and fields. Volunteers joined the effort. Every hour mattered. A child missing from a small community created an atmosphere of fear unlike anything most people there had experienced. And then, after nearly 3 months of uncertainty, the search ended with a discovery no family could ever be prepared to receive. Christine's body was found on December 31st, still 1984, more than 50 kilometers from her home. She had been stabbed to death. Investigators also found semen stains on her underwear. That biological evidence would eventually become the most important evidence in the entire case. But in 1984, forensic DNA profiling was not available to identify the person who had left it behind. The evidence could be collected and preserved, but science could not yet transform it into the precise genetic signature that modern investigators would later use. The killer had left something behind without realizing that one day it might speak for him. The problem was that the world was still years away from knowing how to listen. Police continued investigating. Suspicion eventually settled on Guy Paul Morin. The first serious police interest in him came after Christine's mother described her neighbor as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet. Investigators began watching Morin's home. They interviewed him. They examined his movements on the day Christine disappeared. One of the most important facts was that Morin had been working that day. His time card suggested that the schedule made it difficult, if not impossible, for him to leave work, reach Christine's home, abduct her, and return within the required period. That should have been significant. Instead, suspicion continued to grow. Investigators interpreted Morin's behavior through the lens of guilt. A comment he made about little girls growing up to become corrupt was viewed as suspicious. His manner was viewed as suspicious. His personality was viewed as suspicious. But suspicious behavior is not the same thing as evidence of murder, and the case against Morin would eventually depend heavily on evidence that modern science would expose as unreliable. On April 22nd, Sill, 1985, Morin was arrested. Police searched his home and collected samples of his hair, blood, and saliva. During an interrogation lasting approximately 6 hours, he repeatedly denied killing Christine. He maintained his innocence, yet the investigation continued to build around him. Prosecutors eventually relied on hair and fiber comparisons, along with testimony from jailhouse informants who claimed Morin had confessed while incarcerated. The hair evidence became particularly important. A dark hair found embedded in tissue near Christine's necklace was said to be consistent with Morin's hair. Other hairs found in Morin's car were presented as potentially matching Christine's. Fiber evidence was also used to suggest a connection between Christine and Morin's home and vehicle. To investigators and prosecutors, these pieces appeared to form a pattern. To modern forensic science, however, the limitations were severe. Hair microscopy could not establish the kind of individual identification that jurors might naturally infer from the word. Fiber similarities could arise through ordinary environmental contamination or coincidence, and the evidence had been interpreted within an investigation already heavily focused on Morin. The more pieces that appeared to point toward him, the harder it became for investigators to step back and ask whether the entire theory was wrong. Then came the jailhouse informants. Their testimony would become another devastating component of the prosecution's case. 2 men claimed that Morin had confessed to killing Christine while in custody. They presented themselves as witnesses to an admission that had never actually happened. Later, the Kaufman inquiry would expose serious reliability problems surrounding their testimony. One informant was described as a pathological liar, and both had criminal histories and incentives that raised serious questions about why they were testifying. Yet their words helped reinforce the prosecution's theory. The case went to trial in 1986. The jury heard the hair evidence. It heard the fiber evidence. It heard the jailhouse informant testimony. It heard the arguments surrounding Morin's movements and behavior. And then, on February 7th, Sill 1986, the jury found him not guilty. For a moment, it appeared the system had stopped itself before an irreversible mistake could be made. Morin walked free. But the story was far from over. The Crown appealed the acquittal. In June 1987, the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. Morin appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, but the Supreme Court dismissed his appeal in November 1988. He would have to face another trial. The second trial began in 1990, and this time the atmosphere surrounding the case was even more dangerous. More witnesses came forward with memories that prosecutors presented as evidence of Morin's consciousness of guilt. Some remembered his behavior after Christine disappeared. Some described comments they believed were strange or inappropriate. Some memories appeared years after the events themselves. The prosecution presented these accounts to the jury as part of a broader picture. Again, the investigation had created a narrative in which Morin's personality, behavior, and relationships could be interpreted as signs of guilt. The problem was that memory changes over time. People can become influenced by information they learn later. They can reinterpret ordinary events after discovering that someone has been accused of a terrible crime. The Kaufman inquiry later concluded that several witnesses had provided unreliable evidence, with some changing their testimony in ways that helped support the prosecution's theory. On July 30th, Sill 1992, the second jury found Guy Paul Morin guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The nightmare had become official. The man who had insisted he was innocent was now a convicted murderer. For Christine's family, the verdict did not erase their grief, but it appeared to answer the question of who had killed their daughter. For Morin and his family, however, the verdict was the beginning of another fight. He had already been arrested once. He had already faced one trial. He had already been acquitted. Now he was convicted of a crime he said he did not commit. Outside the courtroom, a small group of supporters refused to accept the verdict. The Justice for Guy Paul Morin committee formed to help him fight for his freedom. It would eventually evolve into what is now Innocence Canada, an organization dedicated to wrongful conviction cases. Morin was granted bail in February 1993 while his appeal continued. The legal team planned to challenge the unreliable hair and fiber evidence and the jailhouse informants. But then something happened that changed everything. DNA testing had advanced enough to examine biological evidence from Christine's underwear. Earlier attempts had not produced a usable result. Now, a more sophisticated test succeeded. The result was devastating to the prosecution's case. The semen found on Christine's underwear did not come from Guy Paul Morin. The DNA proved it. The man who had been convicted of murdering Christine Jessup was not the source of the biological evidence associated with her killer. The discovery was more than an exoneration. It was a direct warning that the entire investigative theory had been wrong. The Ontario Court of Appeal set aside Morin's conviction on January 23, still 1995, and entered an acquittal. The Crown prosecutor expressed deep regret for what Morin and his family had endured. 10 years had passed since his arrest. He had spent 18 months in prison. His name had been permanently associated with the murder of a 9-year-old girl, and now science had established that he was innocent. The consequences were profound. Morin had been free, then accused, then acquitted, then retried, then convicted, then imprisoned, and finally cleared. The same justice system that had convicted him now had to confront how the conviction had happened. In 1996, the lieutenant governor ordered a public inquiry into the causes of the wrongful conviction. The Kaufman Commission began examining the investigation and prosecution. Its eventual report identified multiple failures. Tunnel vision was central. So was unreliable forensic science. So were unreliable witnesses. And so was the use of jailhouse informants. The report reached a conclusion that carried a terrible irony. Science had helped convict Morin, and science had ultimately proved his innocence. The hair evidence that prosecutors had presented as meaningful was far weaker than the jury had been led to believe. The fiber evidence was problematic and had been contaminated. Witness memories had shifted. Informants had lied. Each failure had reinforced the other. The investigation had become a machine in which suspicion generated evidence, evidence reinforced suspicion, and suspicion made contradictory information easier to overlook. The most frightening part was that nobody needed to deliberately invent the entire case. It could happen through ordinary human decisions, each one appearing reasonable in isolation. A strange comment, a questionable memory, a hair, a fiber, a jailhouse informant, a theory, then another theory, then a conviction. That is how an innocent person can end up behind bars while the real killer remains free. And while Morin fought to clear his name, the biological evidence from Christine's body remained. The DNA profile that had exonerated him was not simply proof of innocence. It was also evidence pointing toward an unknown man. Somewhere in the genetic code was the identity of Christine's real killer. Investigators now had something they had not possessed in 1984, a biological profile belonging to the person who had left semen on Christine's underwear. But the profile did not immediately reveal a name. The National DNA Data Bank did not yet exist when Christine was murdered, and even after its creation in 2000, there was no automatic match to the unknown offender. The investigation had therefore reached another painful stage. Morin was innocent, but Christine's killer was still unidentified. For Christine's mother, Janet Jessup, this meant the nightmare remained unfinished. She had lost her daughter. She had watched a neighbor become accused. She had lived through a wrongful conviction. Then she had watched that conviction collapse. And after all of it, the person who had actually killed Christine was still unknown. There was no final answer. No trial. No confession. No punishment. Just a DNA profile waiting in a laboratory. Time continued to move. Technology continued to evolve. Genetic genealogy emerged as a powerful new investigative technique. Investigators could now use DNA from an unknown offender to search for relatives who had voluntarily placed their genetic information into genealogy databases. The search did not identify a suspect directly. Instead, it produced relationships. Those relationships could be assembled into family trees. Eventually, a family could be identified, and from that family, investigators could search for an individual whose history, location, and circumstances fit the crime. This approach had already transformed other cold cases. Now it was coming to Christine Jessup. In 2020, Toronto police announced that they had used genetic genealogy to identify an alternate suspect in Christine's murder. His name was Calvin Hoover. Hoover was not alive to hear the accusation. He had died in 2015, but investigators had something extraordinary waiting for them. A blood sample from Hoover had been retained at the Center of Forensic Sciences after his death. That sample could be compared directly with the DNA profile from the Christine Jessup investigation. The result was conclusive. Hoover's DNA matched the profile associated with the biological evidence from Christina's clothing. The man who had remained unidentified for 36 years finally had a name, and with that name came another shock. Hoover had known the Jessup family. He was not an unknown predator who had appeared from somewhere beyond the community. He had been connected to the people around Christine. The identification did not produce a courtroom drama because Hoover was already dead. But it produced something the family had not possessed since 1984, an answer. Christine's killer had been identified. Guy Paul Morin had been proven innocent. The biological evidence had finally fulfilled the promise it had carried for decades. Yet the story remained deeply unsettling because the solution came only after so much damage had already been done. An innocent man had been convicted, a family had spent decades mourning, and the real killer had died without ever standing before a jury. The case became a lesson in both the power and limitations of forensic science. DNA could exonerate the wrongfully convicted. Genetic genealogy could identify a previously unknown offender, but no technology could reverse the years that had already passed. No database could return Christine to her family. No identification could erase the pain of a mother who had spent decades asking what happened to her daughter. The truth had finally emerged, but it had arrived after the justice system had already inflicted its own terrible wound. And as investigators looked back over the entire case, one fact became impossible to ignore. The biological evidence that eventually exposed Calvin Hoover had been present from the beginning. The truth had not suddenly appeared in 2020. It had been sitting inside the evidence since 1984. What changed was humanity's ability to read it. 36 years after Christine disappeared, science finally translated that silent evidence into a name. The question that remained was how that name had escaped investigators for so long and what the final forensic trail would reveal about the man who had remained hidden while an innocent neighbor paid the price. By the time investigators finally placed Calvin Hoover's name beside the DNA profile, the case had already passed through almost every stage of the criminal justice system, and each stage had left its own scar. A little girl had been murdered. An innocent neighbor had been convicted. That conviction had been overturned by DNA. A public inquiry had examined how the mistake happened, and still, the real killer had remained unidentified. For years, the biological evidence pointed toward an unknown man without revealing who he was. The DNA had exonerated Guy Paul Morin, but it had not yet answered the question Christine's family had been asking since 1984. Who killed their daughter? The answer would eventually come through a technology that barely existed when Christine was alive. Genetic genealogy did not simply compare one suspect with one crime scene sample. It searched for biological relatives. It looked for connections that traditional criminal databases could never provide. And in Christine Jessup's case, those distant genetic connections eventually led investigators to Calvin Hoover, a man who had lived in the same general community and who was already dead by the time police identified him. The breakthrough was astonishing precisely because it came so late. The evidence had been preserved for decades, but the identity remained hidden. Then science opened a door that investigators in 1984 could never have imagined. The road to that discovery, however, began with the painful lessons of the Morin case. When Guy Paul Morin was finally cleared in January 1995, the justice system could no longer simply move on. The wrongful conviction demanded an explanation. How had investigators become so certain that an innocent man was guilty? Why had evidence that pointed away from Moran not received the same weight as evidence that seemed to support the prosecution? Why had unreliable witnesses been permitted to influence the case? And how had forensic evidence been presented to a jury in a way that suggested far more certainty than the science could actually provide? The Ontario government responded by appointing Justice Fred Kaufman to conduct a public inquiry. The Kaufman Commission examined the investigation into Christine's death, the handling and preservation of forensic evidence, and the criminal proceedings involving Moran. Its work was enormous. The inquiry held 146 days of public hearings, heard from 120 witnesses, and examined more than 100,000 pages of evidence and documents. Kaufman released his report in 1998, making 119 recommendations for changes to the administration of criminal justice. The findings became a warning about what can happen when an investigation loses the ability to question its own assumptions. The problem was not simply that one detective made one mistake. The failure was broad. The investigation had developed tunnel vision. Once Moran became the principal suspect, information was increasingly interpreted through the theory that he was responsible. Evidence that seemed suspicious became important. Evidence that contradicted the theory struggled to break through. The result was catastrophic. Moran had spent years carrying the burden of a crime he did not commit, while Christine's real killer remained free. The irony was brutal. The case had produced a conviction, but it had not produced justice. It had produced certainty, but the certainty was false. And while the public inquiry examined what had gone wrong, the biological evidence quietly remained. The semen recovered from Christina's underwear had already performed the first miracle of the case. It had proved Moran was not the source, but DNA could do more than exonerate him. It could potentially identify the person who had actually left the biological material behind. The problem was finding that person. For years, the DNA profile did not match anyone in the available criminal databases. The unknown male remained exactly that. Unknown. No name. No arrest. No confession. No courtroom. The case was solved in one sense and unsolved in another. Investigators knew the person they had convicted was innocent, but they still did not know who had murdered Christine. That distinction is easy to miss when looking back at the case. An exoneration does not automatically equal a solution. It creates another investigation, and in Christine's case, that second investigation would last for decades. The passage of time made the challenge even greater. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Records became harder to locate. People who had lived in the community in 1984 moved away. Others grew old. Some of the investigators who had worked the original case retired. The physical evidence, however, could still speak. That was why preservation mattered. The DNA profile had survived because biological evidence had been retained and because forensic laboratories continued to improve their ability to analyze old material. The importance of preserving forensic evidence became one of the broader lessons of the case. A sample that seemed limited in one generation could become extraordinarily powerful in another. The same evidence that could not identify an offender in 1984 could become the starting point for a genetic genealogy investigation decades later. This was not science fiction. By the 2010 investigators around the world were beginning to use genetic genealogy to solve murders and sexual assaults that had resisted conventional investigation. The principle was different from traditional DNA database searching. If an unknown offender's DNA did not appear in a criminal database, investigators could search for relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to genealogy services. Even a distant relative could provide a clue. The closer the relationship, the more useful the connection could become. But the method required careful interpretation. A genealogical connection did not automatically identify a killer. It generated investigative leads. Detectives still had to build the case through conventional police work and direct forensic comparison. That distinction became important in Christine's case. Investigators were not simply looking at a family tree and declaring that someone was guilty. They were using the genetic relationships to narrow the field. The investigation eventually led to Calvin Hoover. The name represented a dramatic turn in the story. Hoover had lived in the same region as Christine and had connections to the community. He was not simply a theoretical name generated by a computer. He was a real person whose history could be examined. But there was a problem that immediately made the case different from almost every other cold case breakthrough. Hoover was dead. He had died in 2015, years before the genetic genealogy investigation identified him. That meant investigators could not arrest him. They could not interrogate him. They could not search his home while he was alive. They could not watch his movements. They could not obtain a fresh cheek swab from him. The investigation therefore depended on something extraordinary, a preserved blood sample. Hoover had previously provided blood for medical purposes, and a sample was available to investigators. Police could compare that retained DNA with the unknown male profile from Christine's case. The result provided the confirmation investigators needed. Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence associated with Christine. The anonymous profile finally had a name. The implications were enormous. For 36 years, the killer had existed in the case file only as an unknown genetic profile. Now, investigators could attach a human identity to that profile. The person responsible was no longer a statistical possibility. The genetic evidence pointed to Calvin Hoover. Yet, because Hoover had died 5 years earlier, there could be no traditional prosecution. The justice system could identify him, but it could not bring him before a judge. That created a strange form of finality. The investigation had reached its destination, but there would be no trial. No jury would hear the evidence. No defense attorney would challenge the genetic genealogy. No prosecutor would present a closing argument. No judge would pronounce a sentence. Instead, investigators announced the identification publicly, allowing the historical record to finally reflect what the DNA evidence had revealed. For the Jessup family, the announcement brought an answer that had been missing for more than 3 decades. For Morin, it confirmed what he had been saying since the beginning. He had not killed Christine, and for the Canadian justice system, it became a powerful example of why cold cases must remain open to new science. But there was another disturbing dimension. The man identified by DNA had lived in the same world as Christine. He was not a distant stranger from another province whose connection existed only on paper. His identity placed him inside the social geography of the case. That made the discovery feel even more immediate. The killer had not disappeared into some mysterious unknown dimension. He had existed in the community. He had lived a life. He had aged. He had eventually died. And all the while, Christine's family had been waiting for the answer. The DNA breakthrough also forced investigators to reconsider the history of the original investigation. If Hoover was responsible, then every hour spent pursuing Morin represented time taken away from the real offender. The wrongful conviction was, therefore, not only an injustice against Morin, it was also an investigative failure that allowed the actual killer to remain unidentified. That is why the Christine Jessup case cannot be understood simply as a story about DNA solving a murder. It is a story about how the failure to properly evaluate evidence can redirect an entire investigation. It is a story about how confirmation bias can become embedded in a case. And it is a story about how scientific evidence can eventually expose a mistake that human judgment created. The tragedy began with Christine. She was 9 years old. She should have been worrying about school, friends, homework, and the ordinary details of childhood. Instead, she became the victim of a violent crime that would continue affecting people for decades. Her mother had to endure the death of her daughter while also watching an innocent neighbor become the target of the investigation. Morin had to fight to reclaim his life, and investigators had to live with the knowledge that the real offender had escaped identification. The Kaufman inquiry attempted to understand how that happened. Its recommendations helped reshape practices within Canadian criminal justice. The case became part of the national conversation about wrongful convictions and forensic reliability. Yet Christine herself could easily become lost beneath the legal history. That is why returning to the original timeline mattered. Before the courtroom battles, before the public inquiry, before DNA genealogy, there was a 9-year-old girl walking home from school. Everything that followed began with her disappearance. Every forensic test was performed because investigators were trying to answer what happened to her. Every courtroom argument existed because someone had taken her life. Every scientific breakthrough mattered because the truth about Christine had remained incomplete. The technology did not bring her back. It could not erase the years of grief. It could not restore the childhood she lost. But it could establish something that had remained painfully uncertain for decades: who was responsible. That certainty also had another consequence. It allowed the justice system to separate two stories that had been wrongly fused together for years. Guy Paul Morin was not Christine's killer. Calvin Hoover was identified as the source of the DNA associated with the crime. The distinction was finally supported by genetic evidence rather than competing theories. The science had done what the original investigation could not. It had followed the biological trail without caring about personality, reputation, appearance, or assumption. DNA did not know that Morin was considered strange. It did not care what neighbors thought of him. It did not care what jailhouse informants claimed. It simply provided a genetic profile. And that profile eventually pointed somewhere else. The power of that evidence is precisely why the case became so important. The same forensic science that once seemed unavailable had eventually transformed the investigation. The DNA that helped free an innocent man became the foundation for identifying the actual offender. Then genetic genealogy took the next step, connecting the unknown profile to a family and ultimately to Calvin Hoover. It was a chain of evidence stretching across decades, but even after the identification, some questions remained unanswered. Why Christine? What exactly happened during the final hours of her life? Why did Hoover kill her? Was the crime planned or spontaneous? Did he know her? Did he have other victims? Because Hoover was dead, many of those questions might never receive definitive answers. Investigators could establish the genetic connection, but they could not interrogate the man himself. The final chapter therefore remained partly silent. That silence was different from the silence before the breakthrough. Before, nobody knew who the killer was. Afterward, investigators had a name, but not a confession. The mystery narrowed, but it did not disappear entirely. And perhaps the most haunting question was one that had nothing to do with DNA at all. How many years might have been saved if the original investigation had been conducted differently? How different would Christine's family's life have been if the real offender had been identified in 1984? How different would Morin's life have been if the limitations of hair analysis and unreliable informant testimony had been recognized early? These questions cannot be answered with certainty, but the history of the case makes one lesson unmistakable. Evidence must be questioned, even when it appears to fit the theory, because when investigators become convinced too early, an innocent person can become the answer simply because the real answer is harder to find. Christine's murder demonstrated the terrible consequences of that mistake, yet decades later, it also demonstrated something hopeful. Evidence can survive. Science can improve. Cases can be reopened. Mistakes can be corrected. A biological trace can remain silent for 36 years and then suddenly become the loudest piece of evidence in an entire investigation. Calvin Hoover could not be brought to justice in a courtroom, but his identity could finally be established. Guy Paul Morin could finally be separated from the crime that had consumed his life, and Christine Jessup could finally have her story told with the correct name attached to the killer. The case had taken decades to reach that point, but the DNA had never forgotten. It had been waiting in the evidence, untouched by changing memories and shifting theories, and when investigators finally learned how to read it, the silence surrounding Christine's murder began to break. The revelation that Calvin Hoover was the man behind the DNA profile did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a sudden appearance in a police station. It came through years of scientific progress, careful forensic work, and a trail that had survived longer than almost anyone connected to the original investigation could have imagined. By the time Toronto investigators announced the identification in 2020, Christine Jessup had been dead for 36 years. Guy Paul Morin had spent years fighting to clear his name. The original investigation had been examined under a public inquiry, and the biological evidence that had once been incapable of identifying anyone had become precise enough to point investigators toward a specific individual. But there was still another question. How could police be certain that the person identified through genetic genealogy was actually the man whose DNA had been recovered from Christine's clothing? Genetic genealogy could provide an investigative lead, but investigators still needed direct forensic confirmation. That confirmation came through a DNA comparison with a preserved blood sample belonging to Hoover. The genetic profile from that sample matched the unknown male profile associated with Christine's murder. After decades of uncertainty, the biological evidence had finally connected a name to the crime. The announcement was extraordinary, but it also carried an unsettling fact that would define the final chapter. Calvin Hoover was already dead. He had died in 2015. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no courtroom confrontation, no opportunity for prosecutors to ask him why he had taken Christine's life. The man identified by science could not answer the questions that had remained unanswered since 1984. Still, the identification changed everything. For years, the case had contained two competing stories. One involved Morin, the neighbor who had been convicted and later exonerated. The other involved an unknown male whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene. After the 2020 breakthrough, those stories could finally be separated. Morin was innocent. Hoover was identified as the source of the DNA. The case that had once seemed hopeless now had an evidentiary conclusion. Yet for Christine's family, the announcement was not simply a scientific milestone. It was the end of a question that had shaped their lives. For decades, there had been no name to attach to the person responsible for Christine's death. There had been only the memory of a 9-year-old girl who had gone missing and never come home. Now investigators could finally say who had left the biological evidence behind. That mattered because unresolved homicide cases do something strange to families. Time passes, but the central question remains frozen. Birthdays continue, holidays come and go, children grow up, parents grow old, friends move away, communities change, yet one moment refuses to move with them. For the Jessup family, that moment was October 3rd, Sill, 1984. Christine left school. She was expected home. Then she disappeared. Everything after that became part of a nightmare that lasted decades. The discovery of her body on December 31st, Sill, 1984, ended one uncertainty but created another. The family now knew she was dead, but they did not know who had killed her. Then came the accusation against Morin. Then the first trial. Then the acquittal. Then the retrial, then the conviction, then the appeal, then DNA, then exoneration. Each stage seemed to offer an answer, only for another question to appear. By the mid-1990s, Morin had been cleared, but Christine's murderer was still free. The case had become a symbol of two tragedies happening at the same time. A child had been murdered, and an innocent man had been convicted. The public inquiry that followed did more than examine the evidence. It exposed how the investigation had become increasingly committed to the theory that Morin was responsible. The Kaufman Inquiry's findings became a landmark in Canadian criminal justice because they demonstrated how tunnel vision can develop. Gradually, investigators may begin with uncertainty. They identify a suspect. Then they search for evidence. But once a theory becomes dominant, ambiguous evidence can start appearing stronger than it really is. A questionable statement becomes suspicious. A forensic similarity becomes a match. A witness memory becomes more confident with time. Contradictions become explanations instead of warning. Eventually, the theory becomes so deeply embedded that investigators are no longer asking who committed this crime. They are asking, how can we prove this person committed this crime? Christine's case showed the danger of that transformation. The hair evidence used against Morin was later shown to have limitations that were not properly understood at the time. The fiber evidence was compromised by contamination. Jailhouse informants provided unreliable testimony. Witness recollections changed. Yet because the evidence appeared to point in the same direction, the overall case could seem stronger than any individual piece actually was. It was a classic example of cumulative error. Each weak piece reinforced another weak piece until the collection looked convincing. The breakthrough came when DNA interrupted that chain. Biological evidence did not ask whether Morin looked suspicious. It did not care about his personality. It did not care about the impressions of neighbors or the testimony of informants. The DNA simply asked a different question. Does the biological material belong to this man? The answer was no. That scientific answer was devastating because it did not merely create reasonable doubt. It provided direct evidence that the semen recovered from Christine's underwear did not come from Moran. The conviction could no longer stand. The DNA had exposed the weakness of the case that had been built against him. But once Moran was cleared, investigators faced the responsibility of pursuing the evidence further. Somewhere behind that male DNA profile was the actual offender. For years, that profile remained unmatched. Traditional DNA databases could not identify him. The technology could establish that the sample came from one male individual, but it could not attach a name. Then the forensic world began to change. Genetic genealogy introduced a completely different approach. Instead of searching for the offender himself, investigators could search for relatives. DNA can reveal family relationships because relatives share inherited genetic markers. A person does not need to have a criminal record to become relevant to a genetic genealogy investigation. A distant relative who voluntarily submits DNA to a genealogy database can provide an unexpected pathway toward an unidentified suspect. Investigators can use those relationships to build family trees and narrow possibilities using age, location, and historical records. It was this technique that eventually changed Christina's case. Investigators revisited the old male DNA profile. The biological evidence was no longer viewed as a dead end. It became the starting point. The genealogical search produced connections that investigators could follow. Those connections ultimately led to the Hoover family and then to Calvin Hoover. But genealogy alone was not enough. Police needed direct DNA confirmation. That is where the preserved blood sample became critical. Hoover was already deceased, meaning investigators could not obtain a new sample from him. But his blood had been preserved. A comparison could therefore be performed. The result was decisive. The DNA profile associated with Christine's murder matched Hoover. The unknown offender finally had an identity. The announcement in 2020 was therefore not based on speculation. It represented the convergence of old evidence and new technology. The biological material had been recovered decades earlier. Modern genetic genealogy generated the investigative path. Direct DNA comparison provided the confirmation. The combination transformed a cold case from an anonymous mystery into an identified homicide. But the emotional complexity of the case remained. Moran had already endured years of being known as Christine's killer. His exoneration had corrected the legal record, but it could never completely erase what had happened. His arrest had affected his family. His conviction had affected his reputation. His imprisonment had taken time that could never be returned. The identification of Hoover provided another form of vindication. The person convicted in 1992 had not been the person responsible for Christine's death. Science had now established that distinction with extraordinary clarity. The case, therefore, became a story of both wrongful conviction and forensic success. The same investigation that had once demonstrated the danger of unreliable evidence eventually demonstrated the power of reliable evidence. The difference was not simply technology, it was methodology. Modern forensic investigation requires documentation, validation, quality control, and independent interpretation. Genetic genealogy itself is not magic. It is an investigative tool that must be followed by traditional police work and direct forensic testing. In Christine's case, the genealogy pointed investigators toward Hoover, but the DNA comparison provided the crucial confirmation. That sequence mattered. It meant the final identification rested on evidence rather than assumption, and yet the public announcement could not answer everything. Hoover was dead. The opportunity to ask him questions had vanished with his death. Investigators could not know from his own words what had happened inside the final moments of Christine's life. They could not hear him explain why. They could not ask whether the killing had been planned. They could not ask what he had done after leaving Christine. They could not ask whether he had confessed to anyone. The DNA answered the question of identity, but not necessarily the deeper questions of motive and circumstance. That distinction is important in cold cases. Solving a case does not always mean reconstructing every moment. Sometimes the most investigators can establish is who was responsible based on the surviving evidence. In Christine's case, that was enough to end one of the most enduring mysteries in Canada, but not enough to erase every uncertainty. The story also raised questions about whether Hoover had been overlooked during the original investigation. If he lived in the same area and had a connection to the community, why had investigators not identified him in 1984? The answer was partly technological. Police did not have the DNA tools they have today, but the deeper issue was investigative focus. Once Morin became the primary suspect, the search for alternative suspects became less effective. That is exactly why the Kaufman inquiry mattered. The inquiry did not simply document a wrongful conviction. It examined the conditions that made the wrongful conviction possible. Its recommendations sought to reduce the risk of future tunnel vision and improve the handling of forensic evidence. The lessons extended beyond Christine Jessup. Her case became a warning to investigators everywhere. A conviction is not the same thing as the truth. A suspect is not the same thing as a killer, and evidence that appears scientific is not necessarily reliable simply because it is presented by an expert. Science itself must evolve, and when it does, old convictions must sometimes be reconsidered. That lesson became particularly powerful as DNA technology continued to improve. Around the world, old biological evidence began producing new answers. Cases once considered impossible to solve were reopened. Profiles once considered useless became valuable. Genetic genealogy created investigative possibilities that had not existed when Christine was alive. Her murder became part of that broader forensic revolution. The evidence had survived longer than the original assumptions surrounding it. That survival mattered. It meant that the truth had not disappeared when investigators failed to find it. It had simply remained inaccessible. There is something almost haunting about that idea. For decades, the killeress identity existed in the biological evidence without anyone knowing what it meant. The DNA carried information about the offender from the moment it was deposited. Human investigators could not interpret it. Technology eventually could. The evidence had been silent only because people did not yet know how to make it speak. When investigators finally identified Hoover, the timeline suddenly looked different. The disappearance in 1984, the discovery of Christine's body, the investigation of Morin, the conviction, the DNA exoneration, the long search for the unknown male, the emergence of genetic genealogy, the identification of Hoover. Every stage became part of one continuous chain. The chain was imperfect, but it had survived. For Christine's family, the name Calvin Hoover could never undo the past. It could not give them another birthday with Christine. It could not erase the memory of her disappearance. It could not restore the years lost to grief, but it answered the question that had remained open for more than 3 decades. The person responsible was no longer unknown, and for Morin, the answer carried a different significance. His innocence was no longer simply a claim supported by an overturned conviction. The DNA evidence pointing to another man provided a powerful biological explanation for what had gone wrong. The wrong man had been accused. The wrong man had been convicted. The real offender had remained unidentified, and the evidence that eventually exposed the mistake had been sitting there all along. That is what makes Christine Jessup's story more than a cold case solved through modern science. It is a warning about the cost of certainty without proof. It is a reminder that a criminal investigation must remain capable of changing direction. And it is a testament to the strange endurance of forensic evidence. Decades can pass. Witnesses can disappear. Investigators can retire. Suspects can die. Memories can fade. But DNA can remain. In Christine's case, it remained long enough for science to catch up with the truth. And when it finally did, the name that emerged was not Guy Paul Morin. It was Calvin Hoover. The man who had been unknown for 36 years was no longer a mystery. But the next question was even more painful. What could never be recovered from the silence of those missing decades? The name Calvin Hoover closed one chapter of the Christine Jessup investigation, but it could never erase what had happened before. His identity was known. For more than 3 decades, the case had carried 2 different kinds of uncertainty. The first was the uncertainty surrounding Christine's killer. The second was the uncertainty surrounding the man who had been wrongly accused of being that killer When DNA finally connected the biological evidence to Hoover, those uncertainties began to separate. The unknown offender had a name. Guy Paul Morin had been exonerated. But the history between those two discoveries revealed something darker than an ordinary cold case. It showed how an investigation could become trapped inside its own theory, how flawed forensic interpretation could give that theory an appearance of scientific certainty, and how an innocent man could spend years trying to prove what the evidence should have established from the beginning. Christina's murder, therefore, became more than a story about an unidentified killer. It became a story about the consequences of getting the wrong answer first. When Christine disappeared on October 3rd, SIL 1984, nobody knew that the investigation would eventually become one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in Canada. At that moment, the only thing that mattered was finding a missing 9-year-old girl. Her school bag had been left inside the house. Christine herself was gone. Her parents knew immediately that something was wrong. Police and volunteers began searching. The community became consumed by the disappearance. For a time, hope remained possible. Perhaps Christine had wandered somewhere. Perhaps someone had seen her. Perhaps she was still alive. Then, on December 31st, the discovery of her body destroyed that hope. Christine had been stabbed to death. She was found more than 50 kilometers from her home, and investigators recovered biological evidence from her clothing. That evidence would become the most important object in the case, although nobody understood its full significance at the time. The biological material contained information about the killer. It contained a genetic signature, but in 1984, DNA profiling was not yet available as the investigative weapon it would later become. Police had to rely on the methods of the period. They searched for witnesses. They examined physical evidence. They looked at people who might have had access to Christine. And eventually, attention turned toward Guy Paul Morin. Morin lived near the Jessup family. He was familiar to people in the area. Investigators became increasingly interested in him, and his behavior was interpreted through a growing suspicion that he was involved. His work schedule should have raised questions about whether he had enough time to commit the crime. Yet the investigation continued. His personality became part of the story. His appearance and manner were scrutinized. Statements were interpreted as suspicious. Instead of the evidence determining the suspect increasingly determined how the evidence was interpreted. That distinction would become central to the later inquiry. The Kaufman Commission described tunnel vision as an overly narrow focus on an investigative or prosecutorial theory that can distort the evaluation of information. In Morin's case, the theory was that he had killed Christine. Once that theory became dominant, evidence that appeared to support it gained importance, while evidence pointing elsewhere struggled to receive the same attention. The investigation eventually produced hair evidence, fiber evidence, and testimony from jailhouse informants. To a jury, the combination could appear overwhelming, but the appearance of strength was misleading. The hair comparison evidence could not provide the individual identification that investigators and jurors might have assumed. The fiber evidence had been contaminated and was not as probative as prosecutors suggested. The jailhouse informants were unreliable, yet these pieces reinforced one another. One weak piece seemed stronger because another weak piece appeared to support it. That is one of the most dangerous patterns in criminal investigation. When separate uncertainties are combined without recognizing their limitations, the final picture can look much more certain than the underlying evidence deserves. Morin was arrested on April 22nd, SIL 1985. He denied killing Christine. He would eventually face 2 trials. At the first, the jury acquitted him. But the Crown appealed, and the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. The Supreme Court of Canada later dismissed Morin's appeal, and the second trial eventually resulted in a first-degree murder conviction on July 30th. SIL 1992, the conviction transformed suspicion into official history. Morin was no longer simply the neighbor police believed was responsible. He was now a convicted murderer. The public could read his name beside Christine's. The tragedy of the Jessup family and the tragedy of Morin's wrongful conviction became intertwined. Then science intervened. By the early 1990s, DNA testing had advanced enough to examine the semen recovered from Christine's underwear. Earlier attempts had failed to produce usable results. More sophisticated testing finally succeeded. The DNA did not belong to Moran. The result was devastating and definitive. The man who had been convicted of murdering Christine was not the source of the biological evidence. On January 23, SIL 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal set aside his conviction and entered an acquittal. The Crown expressed regret for what Moran and his family had endured. He had spent 10 years fighting the case and 18 months in prison. But DNA had not solved Christine's murder. It had only revealed that the wrong man had been convicted. Somewhere beyond the DNA profile was the real offender. For Christine's mother, Janet Jessup, that meant the nightmare continued. Her daughter was still dead. Her killer was still unknown. The legal system had corrected one terrible error, but it had not provided the answer the family needed. In 1996, a public inquiry was ordered to examine the causes of Moran's wrongful conviction. Justice Fred Kaufman's investigation became one of the most important examinations of a wrongful conviction in Canadian history. The inquiry did not treat the case as a simple collection of individual mistakes. It looked at the system. It examined how investigators and prosecutors had interpreted the evidence, how forensic science had been presented, how witnesses had been handled, and how the theory against Moran had become increasingly entrenched. When the report was released in 1998, it identified numerous contributing factors. Tunnel vision was one of the most important. Bad science was another. Kaufman's findings emphasized that the hair evidence had been overstated and that the fiber evidence was unreliable. The report also addressed the use of questionable informant testimony. The lesson was unmistakable. The conviction had not failed because of one isolated error. It had failed because multiple weaknesses had been assembled into a case that appeared stronger than it really was. The phrase that would remain attached to the case was devastating in its simplicity. Science had helped convict Moran, and science had exonerated him. That sentence captured the contradiction at the heart of the tragedy. Scientific evidence had not automatically made the investigation objective. Poorly understood science could be dangerous, but properly interpreted DNA could also become the tool that corrected the mistake. And as the years passed, that same DNA profile continued to wait for an answer. The unknown male profile did not disappear. It remained part of the evidence, but traditional database searches did not identify the offender. The case became colder. Investigators changed. Technology changed. The world changed. Christine remained 9 years old then genetic genealogy began changing what was possible in cold case investigation. Instead of asking whether an unknown DNA profile matched a person already known to police, investigators could ask whether it matched or was related to someone whose DNA had been voluntarily submitted to a genealogy database. The answer might not be immediate. A distant relative might be found first. That relative could lead to another branch of a family tree. Researchers could then examine historical records and narrow the possibilities. The technique was particularly powerful in cases where conventional DNA databases had failed. Christine's case presented exactly that problem. Investigators had a male profile but no name. Genetic genealogy offered a new route. Toronto police eventually used the method to develop a lead pointing toward Calvin Hoover. The discovery did not instantly prove Hoover was the killer. Genetic genealogy was an investigative tool, not a substitute for direct forensic confirmation. Police still needed to establish whether Hoover's DNA matched the biological evidence from Christine's case. But Hoover had died in 2015, meaning investigators could not obtain a new sample directly from him. Fortunately, a blood sample was already held at the Center of Forensic Sciences. That preserved sample provided the opportunity for confirmation. The comparison produced the result investigators had spent decades waiting for. Hoover's DNA matched the unknown male profile associated with the crime. The biological evidence that had once been incapable of naming anyone had finally identified the offender. Yet the timing was cruel. Hoover could not be arrested. He could not be brought into a courtroom. He could not be asked why he killed Christine. He could not be confronted with the evidence. He could not tell investigators whether the murder had been planned or whether he had acted impulsively. He could not explain what happened after Christine was taken. He could not answer the questions that had survived for 36 years. His death meant that the final chapter would always contain silence, but the identification still mattered. It changed the historical record. It separated the innocent from the guilty. It gave Christine's family a name, and it confirmed that the DNA evidence had been pointing towards someone other than Morin all along. There was a profound irony in the timing. In 1995, DNA had rescued Morin from a wrongful conviction. In 2020, DNA genealogy helped identify the person responsible for Christina's murder. The same category of evidence that had first exposed the injustice eventually revealed the hidden offender. The case, therefore, became an extraordinary demonstration of how forensic science can operate across generations. Evidence collected in one technological era can become decisive in another. The people who collected Christine's biological evidence in 1984 could not have known that decades later, genetic genealogy would transform it into a pathway toward an offender. But because the evidence survived, investigators in the 21st century had something to work with. That is one reason preservation matters so much in cold cases. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it only delays its usefulness. The evidence can wait while technology catches up. Christine's case waited for 36 years. During that time, however, the human consequences were immense. Morin had to rebuild a life after wrongful imprisonment. Christine's family had to live with grief and uncertainty. Investigators had to carry a case that had never been properly resolved. The community had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible had never been identified, and somewhere in that community as history was a man whose DNA would eventually reveal him. The identification of Hoover also forced a final confrontation with the original investigation. If the DNA now pointed to Hoover, what had investigators missed in 1984? Some of the answer lies in the technology that did not exist, but some lies in the human tendency to follow a theory once it appears convincing. The Morin investigation showed why alternative possibilities must remain open. It showed why investigators must continually ask what evidence would look like if their primary suspect were innocent. It showed why forensic experts must explain not only what their evidence suggests, but what it cannot establish. And it showed why prosecutors must resist the temptation to treat a conviction as the ultimate goal. Justice is not about winning. It is about finding the truth. The Kaufman Inquiry's recommendations were intended to reduce the possibility of another case like Morin. But for Christine's family, institutional lessons could never replace the child they lost. Christine was buried on January 7th, still 1985, in the cemetery behind the family home, a place where she had once played. Her mother had described her as happy, sensitive, lively, caring, and enthusiastic about school and sports, particularly baseball. Those details matter because cold cases can become dominated by evidence numbers, courtroom dates, forensic profiles, and names of investigators. But beneath every document was a child. Christine was not a case file. She was a daughter. She was a sister. She was a student. She had a life that existed before October 3rd, still 1984. The investigation began because that life was violently interrupted. Every subsequent development, from Morin's arrest to the DNA exoneration to the identification of Hoover, was an attempt to understand what happened after Christine left school that day. And when the answer finally came, it arrived in a form no one in 1984 could have predicted. There was no confession, no dramatic arrest, no killer standing before cameras. There was only DNA, preserved through time, interpreted by a new generation of investigators using a new generation of science. That was enough to give the unknown offender a name. But it was not enough to give the family every answer. The most painful questions remained locked inside the mind of a dead man. Why Christine? Why her? What did he intend to do? What happened during the final moments? Did anyone else know? Those questions may never be answered, and perhaps that is the final cruelty of a cold case solved after the suspect has died. The identity can be recovered, but the complete story may remain forever incomplete. Still, the most important truth was no longer uncertain. Guy Paul Morin did not murder Christine Jessup. The DNA evidence proved that. Calvin Hoover was identified through genetic genealogy and confirmed through DNA as the source of the biological evidence associated with the crime. The case that had once destroyed an innocent man's life had finally revealed the person connected to the evidence. And after all those years, the silence surrounding Christine began to change, not because the past had disappeared, but because the evidence had finally been allowed to speak. The identification of Calvin Hoover did not erase the years that had passed since Christine Jessup's murder, and it did not provide the courtroom ending that many people would expect from a case finally solved. There would be no dramatic arrest at dawn, no handcuffs closing around the wrists of a suspect, no jury waiting to hear the evidence, and no judge delivering a sentence. Hoover had died in 2015. By the time genetic genealogy led investigators toward him, the man they believed responsible for Christine's murder could no longer answer a single question. Yet the absence of a living suspect did not make the evidence less significant. If anything, it forced investigators to rely even more heavily on the scientific trail that had survived for 36 years. The story now centered on a simple but extraordinary fact. The biological evidence recovered from Christine had outlived the people who had once tried to interpret it. In 1984, investigators had looked at the evidence through the technology and assumptions of their time. In the 1990s, DNA testing transformed the same evidence into the key that freed Guy Paul Moran. In the 2020s, genetic genealogy transformed the unknown DNA profile into a name. 3 different eras. One piece of evidence, and at the center of all of it, the same unanswered question: who had killed Christine? The answer had been waiting inside her case for decades, but before that answer could be accepted, investigators had to retrace the path that led from the anonymous genetic profile to who. Genetic genealogy is often described in dramatic terms, as if investigators simply enter an unknown DNA profile into a computer and receive the name of a murderer. The reality is much more complicated. The technique works by identifying genetic relationships. An unknown forensic profile can be compared against genetic information voluntarily uploaded to genealogy databases. The result may be a distant relative rather than the offender himself. Investigators then construct family trees, study historical records, examine ages and locations, and gradually narrow the possibilities. It is a process that combines genetics with traditional detective work. In Christine's case, the genetic evidence had already established that the biological material belonged to an unknown male. That profile was the starting point. Investigators now had to follow the genetic relationships until they could determine which family contained the person they were looking for. The breakthrough eventually led them to the Hoover family. The name Calvin Hoover emerged from that process, but investigators still needed to verify it through direct forensic evidence. That distinction was essential. Genetic genealogy could identify a candidate. It could not, by itself, establish guilt. The direct comparison would have to come from Hoover's own DNA. But Hoover was dead. That meant there was no opportunity to collect a conventional cheek swab. Fortunately, investigators located a preserved blood sample. The sample allowed forensic scientists to compare Hoover's genetic profile directly with the unknown profile from Christine's case. The result was a match. The biological evidence associated with Christine pointed to Calvin Hoover. The anonymous man who had existed in the case file for decades finally had a name. For investigators, that was the moment when a cold case became an identified homicide. For Christine's family, however, the emotional meaning was far more complicated. The name answered one question, but created another. How had the person responsible managed to remain unidentified for so long? The answer began with the circumstances of 1984. DNA profiling was not yet a routine investigative tool. The biological material could be collected, but investigators could not extract the kind of detailed genetic profile that modern forensic laboratories can produce. Instead, the case depended on conventional investigative techniques. Witnesses were questioned. Physical evidence was examined. Suspects were considered. And as investigators increasingly focused on Guy Paul Moran, the possibility that another man had committed the crime became less prominent. That failure would have consequences far beyond the original investigation. When Moran was eventually convicted, the case appeared solved, but the conviction created a false sense of finality. The real killer remained outside the justice system, and because the investigation was focused on Moran, there was less pressure to identify the unknown male associated with the biological evidence. When DNA later proved Moran innocent, investigators suddenly had to confront a terrifying reality. They had spent years pursuing the wrong man. The actual offender had been free the entire time. The discovery was devastating because it demonstrated how a wrongful conviction can damage not only the accused, but the original victim's family and the broader investigation. Moran had lost years of his life. Christine's family had lost years without answers, and the killer had remained beyond reach. The case became a lesson in the danger of investigative tunnel vision. Once investigators believe they know who committed a crime, every subsequent piece of information can be filtered through that belief. A suspicious personality becomes evidence. An ambiguous forensic result becomes a match. A witness's uncertain memory becomes certainty. Contradictions become explanations. And eventually, the theory can become stronger than the facts supporting it. The Moran case demonstrated exactly how that process can unfold. The Kaufman inquiry later examined these failures in extraordinary detail. It heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, witnesses, and others involved in the case. The inquiry's findings became a landmark examination of wrongful conviction and police investigation in Canada. Its recommendations addressed issues ranging from forensic evidence to police procedures and the handling of informants. The case had become a warning written into Canadian legal history. But the inquiry could not solve Christine's murder. It could only explain how the investigation had gone wrong. The unknown DNA profile remained. For years, it was one of the few pieces of evidence that investigators could trust. It had already proved Moran was not responsible. Now it had to be used to find the person who was. The passage of time made that challenge difficult. People who had lived in Queensville in 1984 aged. Some died. Memories faded. The community changed. The world around the case changed, but the biological evidence remained remarkably stable. It had no memory problems. It did not forget. It did not become confused by media coverage. It did not reinterpret events after hearing new information. Its genetic information remained the same. The only thing that changed was the ability of investigators to analyze it. That is what makes DNA so powerful in cold cases. The evidence itself may be decades old, but the technology used to interpret it can be modern. A sample that seemed almost useless to investigators in one era can become extraordinarily valuable in another. Christine's case became a perfect example. The biological evidence could not identify the killer in 1984. It could exonerate Moran in the 1990s, and eventually, with genetic genealogy, it could identify Hoover in the 21st century. The scientific journey therefore mirrored the legal journey. First came uncertainty, then conviction, then doubt, then exoneration, then renewed investigation, then identification. Each stage forced investigators to reconsider what they thought they knew. But there was another piece of the story that made the final identification especially painful. Hoover was not simply a name appearing from nowhere. His life intersected with the same geographic and social environment in which Christine had lived. That meant the killer had not been some unknowable figure existing only in a forensic database. He had been a person who moved through the same world. He had lived among people who knew him. He had eventually grown old and died. The possibility that Christine's killer had remained in the surrounding community while her family continued searching for answers added another layer to the tragedy. For decades, the Jessup family had no way of knowing whether the person responsible was nearby or far away. They could not know whether he had followed the investigation. They could not know whether he had read newspaper reports about Moran. They could not know whether he had watched the wrongful conviction unfold. They could not know whether he had ever felt fear that the truth might be discovered. Those questions remain largely unanswered because Hoover was never interrogated about the crime. His death closed that door permanently. Investigators could establish the biological connection, but they could not recover his private thoughts. There would be no confession explaining the motive, no statement revealing what he believed would happen, no admission describing the final moments of Christine's life. The DNA could identify the source of the biological evidence, but it could not speak in his voice. That limitation is often overlooked when a cold case is described as solved. Solved can mean many things. Sometimes it means a suspect is arrested, charged, convicted, and sentenced. Sometimes it means a suspect confesses. Sometimes it means forensic evidence establishes responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. In Christine's case, the identification came after the suspect's death. There was no prosecution. The legal process could not proceed. The case could be identified and explained through forensic evidence, but it could not end with punishment. For Christine's family, that distinction may have mattered enormously. They finally knew who had been responsible, but there was no opportunity to see him answer for it. There was no courtroom moment when the family could confront the person accused of taking Christine away. There was only the knowledge that the DNA had finally exposed him. Yet that knowledge also carried another meaning. It validated the years of doubt surrounding Morin's conviction. Morin had always said he did not kill Christine. The DNA had already established that. Now the identification of Hoover provided a positive answer to the question of who had left the biological evidence behind. The two pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. Morin was innocent. Hoover was identified as the source of the DNA. The original prosecution theory had been wrong. The case had been redirected by science. That sequence matters because wrongful convictions often leave behind an uncomfortable question. If the convicted person did not commit the crime, who did? Without an alternative explanation, doubt can linger. Christine's case eventually provided that explanation. The biological evidence did not merely remove Morin from the crime, it led investigators toward another man. That is why the genetic genealogy breakthrough was so significant. It did not simply reopen an old question. It provided a pathway toward an answer. The process also demonstrated how modern forensic investigation can correct historical failures. Technology cannot guarantee justice, but when used carefully, it can reveal errors that earlier generations could not detect. It can challenge old assumptions. It can reopen evidence. It can transform a cold case from a historical mystery into a solvable investigation. The Christine Jessup case became an example of that potential. But behind the science remained a family. Christina's mother had lived through the disappearance of her 9-year-old daughter, the discovery of her body, the investigation of a neighbor, the conviction of that neighbor, the exoneration, and then decades of uncertainty. Each legal development changed what the family believed about the case. First, they were told someone had been arrested. Then they watched him walk free. Then they watched him convicted. Then they learned he was innocent. Then they waited for the real killer to be found. The emotional exhaustion of that process is difficult to measure. A homicide normally produces one devastating moment. A wrongful conviction can produce another. An unsolved murder adds another. Christina's family experienced all of them. The eventual identification of Hoover, therefore, represented more than the end of an investigation. It was the restoration of a piece of truth that had been missing since 1984. The truth could not undo the loss, but it could prevent Christine's murder from remaining permanently unresolved. Her killer was no longer an unknown male profile. He had a name. The forensic trail had reached its destination, and the story of the investigation could finally be told without repeating the original mistake. The man convicted in 1992 was not the murderer. The man identified through genetic genealogy was the person connected to the biological evidence. The science had drawn a line between them. That line had taken decades to establish. The tragedy was that the truth had been available in fragments for years. The biological evidence had existed. The DNA profile had existed. The possibility of an unknown offender had existed. What was missing was the technology and investigative perspective necessary to connect those fragments. Once that connection was made, the case changed instantly. A 36-year-old mystery became a historical identification, but one thing remained unchanged. Christine Jessup was still the 9-year-old girl who left school on October 3rd, SIL 1984, expecting to go home. She never got there. The years that followed became a long search for the truth, and when the truth finally arrived, it did not come loudly. It came through a genetic profile, a family tree, a preserved blood sample, and a scientific comparison. It came quietly, but it was powerful enough to rewrite the history of the case. The killeress identity was no longer hidden. The innocent man's name could finally be separated from the crime, and after 36 years, the evidence that had been silent since Christine's death finally spoke. The final identification of Calvin Hoover changed the meaning of almost every major event in the Christine Jessup investigation because, once investigators knew whose DNA had been recovered from the evidence, the history could no longer be viewed only through the lens of Guy Paul Morin. The original theory had placed Morin at the center of the case. The conviction had made that theory appear official, but the DNA evidence had quietly dismantled it. First, the science established that Morin was not the source of the biological material. Decades later, the same evidence pointed toward Hoover. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One man had spent years carrying the consequences of a crime he did not commit. Another man had remained unidentified until after his death. Between them stood Christine Jessup, a 9-year-old girl whose family had waited more than 3 decades for the truth. The case therefore became a rare example of forensic evidence performing 2 different functions across time. First, correcting a wrongful conviction, and later, identifying the person connected to the crime. But even with Hoover's name established, investigators still had to confront the limits of what could be known. DNA can answer who contributed biological material. It cannot necessarily explain motive. It cannot reconstruct every movement. It cannot reveal what a person was thinking. And because Hoover was dead, many of those questions would remain permanently outside the reach of investigators. That absence created an unusual ending. The case had a name, but no confession. It had forensic confirmation, but no trial. It had an identified offender, but no sentence. Justice had arrived in one sense and remained incomplete in another. The story of Christine Jessup had always contained that tension. From the beginning, the investigation was shaped by the pressure to find someone responsible. When a 9-year-old disappears, investigators cannot afford to treat the case casually. The urgency is immediate. Every minute matters. Every possible witness matters. Every unusual detail matters. But urgency can also create pressure, and pressure can encourage investigators to settle on a theory before the evidence is ready. In Christine's case, that pressure eventually contributed to the focus on Morin. The evidence against him seemed to accumulate, but much of it was weaker than it appeared. Hair comparison evidence was later discredited as individual identification. Fiber evidence was compromised. Informant testimony proved unreliable. Yet at the time, these elements were assembled into a narrative that persuaded a jury. The narrative became stronger than the evidence itself. That distinction is crucial. Criminal cases are stories, whether investigators intend them to be or not. A prosecutor presents a sequence of events. A suspect is placed into that sequence. Evidence is interpreted as supporting the story. When the story feels coherent, people can begin to overlook the fact that individual pieces may be uncertain. The Morin prosecution demonstrated the danger. The theory explained the evidence, but the evidence did not actually prove the theory. DNA eventually exposed the difference. It provided a test that was less vulnerable to subjective interpretation. Either the biological profile matched Morin or it did not. It did not. The conviction collapsed, but the case did not end there. In fact, the exoneration created a new investigative imperative. If Morin was innocent, then the biological material belonged to someone else. Somewhere there was a man whose genetic profile had been sitting in the evidence file for years. That man was the real target. The problem was that traditional forensic databases had no name for him. Investigators could search, they could compare, they could wait for future technology, but nothing produced an identity. The case entered a long period of silence. That silence was not the absence of evidence, it was the absence of a usable connection. The DNA profile existed, the person existed, the link between them did not. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. Modern genealogical databases created a new possibility. Even if an offender had never been arrested, a relative might have voluntarily submitted DNA for ancestry research. A distant cousin might be enough. A family connection could lead investigators toward a branch of a family tree. From there, researchers could use public records to reconstruct relationships across generations. The process could narrow an enormous population into a manageable group of candidates. That is how a biological mystery can become a genealogical mystery and eventually a police investigation. In Christine's case, that process led toward Calvin Hoover. His identity was not simply guessed. It emerged from a chain of genetic relationships and investigative research. But investigators understood that a genealogical lead was not the same thing as proof. The final confirmation required direct comparison. Hoover's preserved blood sample provided it. When the DNA from that sample matched the forensic profile, the case reached a point that investigators in 1984 could never have imagined. The unknown male had become a known individual. The technology had bridged 36 years, yet the discovery also created a haunting question. Had Hoover been living with the secret all those years? Investigators could never fully answer that because he died in 2015. There was no opportunity to act. He could not explain whether he had followed the news. He could not explain whether he knew Morin had been convicted. He could not explain whether he had ever feared that DNA would eventually identify him. The final years of his life, therefore, remain largely separate from the investigation. His identity was recovered from evidence rather than from his own words. That is one of the strangest features of the case. The man who had remained hidden for decades was eventually found not because he confessed, but because his DNA had relatives. His biological family tree became the map that led investigators to him. In a sense, the evidence did what witnesses could not. It remembered human memory is fragile. People forget dates. They confuse events. They die. DNA does not. The genetic profile recovered from Christine's case did not change with time. The only thing that changed was the ability to interpret it. This is why cold cases can remain alive even when they appear dormant. A case file may sit untouched for years, but the evidence inside it can retain value. New technology can turn old material into new information. New databases can provide connections that investigators could not have imagined. New forensic methods can revisit samples once considered inconclusive. The past can become investigatively useful again. But Christine's case demonstrated that principle in the most dramatic possible way. The same biological evidence that helped prove Morin's innocence eventually helped identify Hoover. That continuity is important because it prevents the case from being reduced to a story about a miraculous technological breakthrough. The technology mattered, but the preservation of evidence mattered first. Without the original biological material, there would have been nothing for modern science to analyze. Without the DNA profile, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to search. Without the preserved blood sample, investigators could not have directly confirmed Hoover's identity. The final answer depended on a chain of evidence that stretched across generations of forensic science. But the emotional center of the story remained unchanged. Christine was still the victim. She had been 9 years old when she died. Her life before the murder had been ordinary in the best sense. She attended school. She played sports. She had friends. She had family. She had plans that would never be completed. After her death, the world continued moving while her life remained fixed in time. People around her grew older. Her classmates became adults. The town changed. Investigators retired. New technologies appeared, yet Christine remained forever 9. That is one of the cruelest realities of child homicide. The victim does not get to age alongside everyone else. Their family must carry the memory of the person they were at the moment they were taken. For Christine's family, the identification of Hoover could not change that reality. But it could change the way her story was remembered. Instead of being remembered primarily as the girl whose murder led to the wrongful conviction of an innocent neighbor, Christine could finally be remembered as the victim whose killer was identified through modern forensic science. That distinction matters. The wrong man had dominated the case for years. Morin's name had appeared in headlines. His arrest had generated public attention. His trials became legal history. His exoneration became a national story. But Christine herself risked becoming secondary to the controversy surrounding the wrongful conviction. The eventual identification of Hoover redirected the focus back toward the original crime. The case was no longer only about how the justice system failed Moran. It was also about how science finally succeeded in identifying the person connected to Christine's death. Yet even then, the investigation could not recover every lost detail. The location where Christine's body was found remained a painful part of the story. She had disappeared from her neighborhood and was discovered months later in a different location. The distance between those places represented the gap investigators had spent years trying to cross. How had she been taken? How had she been transported? Why had the killer chosen that location? What happened during the missing hour? Some of those questions could potentially be inferred from evidence, but without Hoover alive to provide testimony, certainty was impossible. Investigators could establish a biological connection. They could not manufacture a confession. That limitation is a reminder that solving a homicide and understanding it are not always the same thing. A case can be scientifically solved while emotionally remaining incomplete. The family can know who was responsible while still not knowing why. The public can know the identity while still wondering what happened inside the final moments. The legal system can correct a wrongful conviction while still being unable to punish the actual offender. Christine's case contained all of those contradictions. It was solved and unsolved at the same time, depending on what question was being asked. Who killed Christine? Investigators eventually had an answer. Why did he do it? The answer remained uncertain. Was Moran responsible? No. Did the DNA point to another man? Yes. Could Hoover be prosecuted? No. Did the family finally receive the truth? They received a crucial part of it. Those distinctions are essential because sensational headlines often compress decades of investigation into a single sentence. Cold case solved. But behind that phrase is a complicated human history. There were years of investigation, years of legal proceeding, years of doubt, years of waiting, and years in which the wrong person carried the burden of the crime. The real significance of the breakthrough was therefore not simply that a suspect had been identified. It was that the evidence had finally corrected the record. The case had once told a false story. Modern DNA helped replace it with a more accurate one. That process also demonstrated why wrongful convictions must remain open to review. A conviction can feel final. A courtroom can produce an official judgment, but science can later reveal that the judgment was wrong. When that happens, the justice system must have the courage to reconsider its own conclusions. Moran's case showed that reconsideration can take years. The DNA evidence that eventually cleared him had to overcome a conviction that had already been affirmed through the legal process. The truth did not become true because a court declared it. It became undeniable because the evidence changed what could be proven. The same principle later applied to Hoover. Investigators did not identify him because they needed a convenient suspect. They identified him because the genetic evidence led them there, and a direct comparison confirmed the match. That difference between theory and evidence was the central lesson of the entire case. The original investigation had begun with a theory and interpreted evidence around it. The final investigation began with evidence and followed it toward an identity. That is why the ending feels so different from the beginning. In 1984, investigators were searching for a person who fit their theory. Decades later, investigators were searching for the person who fit the DNA. The second approach led somewhere the first one never did. It led to Calvin Hoover, and once his name entered the case, the 36-year silence surrounding the unknown male profile was broken. The evidence had finally crossed the distance between a laboratory result and a human identity. But the silence around Christine herself could never be broken in the same way. She could not speak about what happened. Her family could not recover the lost years. The community could not return to the moment before her disappearance. All anyone could do was reconstruct the truth from what remained. A child's life had ended. An innocent man had been imprisoned. A killer had escaped identification for decades, and a small biological trace had survived every mistake. It survived the first investigation. It survived the wrongful conviction. It survived the exoneration. It survived the passage of time. Then, modern science finally caught up with it. That trace became the key to a name. The mystery had not vanished. It had been narrowed to one person, and the deeper story was only becoming clearer. Sometimes the most important evidence in a murder case is not the evidence that speaks loudest at the beginning, but the evidence that survives long enough to be understood. The breakthrough did not arrive with the kind of dramatic moment people imagine when they hear the words "cold case solved." There was no suspect standing beneath a bank of television cameras. There was no confession. There was no courtroom. There was no final confrontation between a grieving family and the man responsible for their loss. Instead, the breakthrough came quietly, through evidence that had survived longer than almost everyone expected it to. A genetic profile, a family connection, a name. Then a comparison that transformed a possibility into a forensic conclusion. Calvin Hoover was identified as the man whose DNA had been recovered in connection with Christine Jessup's murder, bringing an extraordinary 36-year investigation to its most important answer. But the deeper investigators looked into the history of the case, the more complicated that answer became, because Christine's murder was never simply an unsolved homicide. It was also the story of a wrongful conviction, a flawed investigation, disputed forensic science, and a justice system that had once announced the wrong man as the killer. Now, decades later, the evidence had forced the story to be rewritten, and rewriting that story meant going back to the beginning, to the moment when Christine disappeared and the small Ontario community around her was suddenly transformed by fear. On October 3rd, still 1984, Christine was 9 years old. She had gone to school that day like countless other children. There was nothing about the morning that suggested history was about to change. No alarm, no warning, no obvious sign that she would never return home. Then the ordinary rhythm of the day broke. Christine did not come home. Her absence quickly became impossible to ignore. Her parents knew something was wrong. Police became involved. Search efforts began. People looked through the area, hoping that somewhere there would be a simple explanation. A missing child could still be found. A child could still walk through a door hours later. A child could still be brought home. But Christine did not return. The search continued, and the uncertainty became heavier. Then came December 31st, still 1984. Christine's body was found in a wooded area near Queensville, Ontario. She had been murdered. The search for a missing child had become a homicide investigation. The emotional shock was enormous. A 9-year-old had vanished from her community and was found dead. Weeks later, investigators now had to determine who had taken her, who had killed her, and why. Physical evidence was collected, biological material was recovered. That evidence would eventually become the most important element in the entire investigation. But in 1984, its future significance could not yet be understood. The technology that would eventually identify the offender was still developing. Investigators instead relied on the forensic methods available at the time, along with interviews, observations, witness accounts, and theories about people who might have had an opportunity to harm Christine. The investigation gradually focused on Guy Paul Moran. Moran lived near the Jessup family and was known in the community. Police questioned him, examined his behavior, and considered him a suspect. As the investigation progressed, the focus intensified. The case began to develop a narrative in which Moran occupied the central role. That narrative would eventually become so powerful that evidence was interpreted through it rather than independently of it. Hair analysis became part of the case. Fiber evidence became part of the case. Jailhouse informants became part of the case. Each element appeared to add another piece to the theory, but the later examination of the case would show that these pieces were not nearly as strong as they appeared. The hair evidence could not establish that the hairs belonged to Moran with the certainty implied at trial. The fiber evidence was compromised by contamination. Informant testimony proved unreliable. Yet by the time these weaknesses were fully exposed, Moran had already endured years of suspicion and legal proceeding. His first trial ended in acquittal, but the case did not end there. A retrial followed, And in 1992, Moran was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction seemed to close the investigation for the public. There was now an answer. Christine had been murdered, and the justice system had identified the person responsible. But beneath that apparent certainty remained a piece of evidence that did not fit the story: the biological material recovered from Christine. Modern DNA testing would eventually reveal that the semen recovered from her underwear did not come from Moran. That result was devastating. The conviction that had appeared final was suddenly impossible to defend. On January 23, still 1995, Moran's conviction was set aside, and an acquittal was entered. The man who had spent years being treated as Christine's killer was officially cleared, but clearing Moran created an even more disturbing problem. If he had not left the biological evidence behind, then someone else had. The actual killer was still out there. The DNA profile had become the silent fingerprint of an unknown man. Investigators could say what the profile represented, but they could not say who it belonged to. That distinction would haunt the case for years. The DNA had accomplished something extraordinary by proving Moran innocent, but it had not yet accomplished what Christine's family needed most: identifying the person who had killed their daughter. The case, therefore, entered a new phase. The investigation was no longer simply about proving or disproving Moran's guilt. It was about finding an unknown male whose biological evidence had survived from 1984. The public inquiry into the wrongful conviction added another layer. Justice Fred Kaufman examined the investigation and the legal proceedings, producing a report that contained 119 recommendations. The inquiry exposed the dangers of tunnel vision and highlighted failures involving forensic evidence, witness testimony, and investigative practices. The case became a national warning about how easily a criminal investigation can drift toward a predetermined conclusion. But the inquiry did not reveal Christine's killer. It explained how the wrong man had been convicted. The unknown man remained unknown. For years, traditional DNA database searches produced no identification. The profile was there, but there was no corresponding name. Investigators could not simply manufacture a suspect. They had to wait for the technology or the database to provide a connection. Then the forensic world changed. Genetic genealogy began offering investigators a new way to approach unidentified DNA profiles. Instead of looking only for an exact match in a criminal database, investigators could search for relatives. A distant genetic relationship could reveal a family. A family could reveal a branch could reveal an individual, and an individual could become a forensic suspect. The technique had already begun transforming other cold cases around the world. Now it was applied to Christine's case. The old DNA profile was no longer considered a dead end. It was a starting point. The search produced genetic connections that investigators could follow through genealogical research. Eventually, those connections led toward Calvin Hoover. Hoover was not identified simply because his name appeared in a database. The genealogy work created a lead. Investigators then had to test whether the lead was supported by direct DNA evidence. That was where the case took another extraordinary turn. Hoover was already dead. He had died in 2015. The man investigators believed was responsible could never be arrested or interrogated, but a preserved blood sample existed. Investigators were able to obtain the DNA profile from that sample and compare it with the unknown male profile associated with Christine's murder. The comparison matched. The name Calvin Hoover was no longer merely a genealogical possibility. His DNA corresponded to the biological evidence recovered in the case. The scientific trail had reached its destination. The significance was enormous, but the emotional consequences were complicated. If Hoover had been alive, the next steps would have been obvious. Investigators could arrest him. Prosecutors could review the evidence. A defense attorney could challenge the case. A judge and jury could evaluate the evidence. Christine's family could attend the proceedings. The accused could speak for himself. None of that was possible. Hoover was dead. His death meant that the investigation could identify him but could not prosecute him. There would be no trial capable of answering every question. There would be no sentence. There would be no opportunity to ask him what happened on the day Christine disappeared. His silence was permanent, and yet that silence could not erase the DNA. The evidence had survived him. In fact, the evidence had survived everyone's assumptions about the case. It had survived the original investigation. It had survived Moran's conviction. It had survived the public inquiry. It had survived decades of failed searches. Then modern genetic genealogy gave investigators a route toward the person who had left it behind. This is where the Christine Jessup case becomes especially powerful as a story about forensic science. DNA did not solve everything at once. It worked in stages. First, it exposed the wrong conviction. Then it preserved the possibility of finding the real offender. Finally, new technology provided the connection necessary to identify him. Each stage depended on the previous one. Without the biological evidence recovered in 1984, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, Moran could not have been excluded. Without the unknown male profile, investigators would have had no genetic target for the later genealogical investigation. Without the genealogical lead, Hoover might never have been considered. Without the preserved blood sample, investigators could not have directly confirmed the connection. The case was therefore not solved by one miracle. It was solved by a chain of evidence that stretched across decades. Every link mattered. The discovery also changed the way Moran's wrongful conviction was understood. Before Hoover was identified, Moran's exoneration had established that he was not the source of the biological evidence. But the question of who was responsible remained open. After Hoover was identified, there was finally an alternative explanation supported by forensic evidence. The man who had been convicted was not the man whose DNA was found. Another individual's DNA matched the profile. The original theory had been wrong. That realization carried a painful irony. The investigation had once seemed certain enough to put Moran behind bars, yet the truth had been sitting inside the evidence, waiting for science to catch up. The case became an example of why certainty should never replace verification. An investigator can be convinced. A prosecutor can be convinced. A jury can be convinced. But evidence must still be tested independently. In Christine's case, the evidence that eventually mattered most was the evidence that could not be persuaded by a theory. DNA did not care who investigators suspected. It did not care what neighbors believed. It did not care how persuasive a witness sounded. It provided a genetic profile, and that profile remained unchanged. The human interpretation surrounding it changed repeatedly. First, the case pointed toward Moran. Then DNA pointed away from him. Decades later, genealogy pointed toward Hoover. Finally, direct comparison confirmed the connection. The evidence had effectively corrected the human story. But even with that correction, one enormous question remained. Why? Why did Hoover kill Christine? Why was a 9-year-old girl targeted? What happened between the moment she disappeared and the moment her body was found? What was the killer thinking? What did he do afterward? Did he ever discuss the crime with anyone? Did he follow the investigation? Did he know that another man had been convicted? Did he understand that DNA could eventually expose him? These are the questions that no genetic profile can answer. The science could identify the source of biological evidence, but it could not recover a dead man's thoughts. That is the cruel boundary of forensic investigation. Technology can become astonishingly precise, but it cannot resurrect the missing voice of the person responsible. For Christine's family, the identification therefore brought both closure and incompleteness. They finally had a name, but no explanation. They finally had a scientific answer, but no confession. They finally knew the identity of the person connected to the crime, but they could not see him stand before a court. The years that had passed could not be reversed. Christine would remain 9 forever. Her mother could never recover the decades stolen by grief and uncertainty. Her family could never return to the day before the disappearance and change what happened. But something important had changed. The historical record was no longer built around an innocent man. It was no longer dominated by the assumption that the case had been solved in 1992. The truth was more complicated and, in some ways, more devastating. The wrong man had been convicted. The real offender had remained unidentified, and the evidence that eventually exposed the truth had been present all along. That realization is perhaps the most haunting part of Christine Jessup's story. The killer was not invisible. His DNA was there. The evidence knew him. It simply took 36 years for investigators to learn his name, and by the time they did, the man himself was gone. The silence had finally been broken, but the voice that could have explained everything had disappeared forever. The discovery of Calvin Hoover's identity brought the Christine Jessup investigation to a point that investigators in 1984 could never have imagined, but it also exposed the painful difference between identifying a killer and understanding a murder. The DNA could tell investigators that Hoover was the source of the biological evidence. Genetic genealogy could help lead them to his name. A preserved blood sample could confirm the connection. But none of those scientific breakthroughs could recreate the missing hours of October 3rd, SIL 1984. None could tell Christine's family what Hoover was thinking. None could explain why a 9-year-old girl became the victim of a crime that would haunt Canada for decades. And none could give investigators the one thing that every homicide investigation ultimately seeks when the evidence is incomplete: offender's own account of what happened. Hoover was dead. His voice was gone. His secrets had gone with him. What remained was the evidence, and the evidence had already changed the story once before. It had rescued Guy Paul Morin from a wrongful conviction. Now it had identified the man connected to Christine's murder. The significance of that connection became even clearer when investigators looked back at the years during which the case appeared to be solved. After Morin's conviction in 1992, the public could have believed that the investigation was over. There was a defendant, there was a verdict, there was a sentence, there was a legal conclusion. But a verdict can be wrong. A conviction can be wrong. And in Christine's case, the scientific evidence eventually proved exactly that. The DNA testing that emerged in the early 1990s changed everything because it offered something the earlier forensic methods could not: a biological comparison capable of directly excluding Morin. The result was not a matter of interpretation. It was not a question of whether a hair looked similar or whether a fiber seemed consistent. The semen recovered from Christine's underwear did not belong to Morin. That fact destroyed the foundation of the conviction. On January 23, SIL 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Morin's conviction and acquitted him. A decade had passed since his arrest. He had spent 18 months in prison. His name had become inseparable from a murder he did not commit. Now the legal system was forced to acknowledge the truth, but the exoneration did not produce immediate peace. For Morin, freedom meant rebuilding a life damaged by the accusation and conviction. For Christine's family, the exoneration meant another painful realization. The person responsible for their daughter's murder was still unknown. The case had returned almost to where it began, except now investigators possessed one extraordinary clue. The DNA belonged to a man who had not been identified. The unknown profile became the center of the renewed search. But years passed without a name. Traditional investigative methods had limits. Criminal databases could identify offenders who had previously provided DNA, but they could not identify someone whose genetic profile had never entered the system. If the offender had never been arrested or convicted for an offense requiring DNA collection, the database could remain silent. The profile could sit there indefinitely. That was the problem investigators faced with Christine's case. They knew the biological evidence came from a male. They knew it did not belong to Morin. They had a forensic profile. What they did not have, a person attached to it. And without that person, the investigation could not move toward prosecution. The case remained open, but open did not mean active every day. Cold cases live in a strange space. They are not forgotten, but they are no longer surrounded by the constant urgency of a fresh homicide. Investigators change assignments. Files move. Resources are redirected. New crimes demand attention. Technology evolves quietly in laboratory, yet the evidence remains. Christine's case became one of those investigations in which the past waited for the future. The future arrived through genetic genealogy. The technique offered investigators a completely different strategy. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA profile belonged to someone already known to police, investigators could ask whether the profile was related to someone whose genetic information was available through genealogy research. That distinction was revolutionary. A criminal database searches for offenders. A genealogy database can reveal families. and families can lead investigators toward people who have never appeared in a police file. A distant relative could become the first thread. That thread could lead to another relative. Researchers could construct family trees, examine generations, identify geographical connections, and narrow the possibilities. The process could transform an anonymous genetic profile into an investigative map. In Christina's case, that map eventually led investigators toward Calvin Hoover. The discovery was remarkable because Hoover had not been waiting inside a conventional criminal database as an obvious suspect. His connection emerged through genetic relationships, but investigators still had to establish that the genealogical lead was correct. They could not simply announce that a person was the killer because his family appeared in a DNA search. The next step required direct forensic confirmation. Hoover's death complicated that process, but it did not make it impossible. A preserved blood sample existed. That sample provided investigators with the opportunity to obtain Hoover's genetic profile and compare it directly with the unknown male profile from Christina's case. The result was a match. The significance of that moment is difficult to overstate. For 36 years, the biological evidence had represented an unknown man. Now it represented Calvin Hoover. The anonymous profile had become a human identity, yet the identity arrived without the dramatic conclusion usually associated with a homicide investigation. Hoover could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. He could not be charged. He could not stand trial. He could not be sentenced. His death had already removed those possibilities. Investigators could identify him, but they could not ask him to account for the crime. This created a strange form of justice. The truth had finally emerged, but punishment was impossible. For Christine's family, that reality could produce conflicting emotion. Knowing the name of the person responsible could bring relief after decades of uncertainty, but knowing that he was already dead meant there could be no confrontation and no courtroom. The family would never hear an explanation from the man himself. The absence of that explanation left the emotional center of the case unresolved. What exactly happened to Christine after she disappeared from her neighborhood? How did she encounter Hoover? What was the sequence of events that led to her death? Why did he leave biological evidence behind? Did he know that his DNA could eventually identify him? Did he ever imagine that modern science might find him after he was gone? These questions have no simple answers. Some might be inferred from the physical evidence, but inference is not the same as certainty. That distinction is important because cold case stories can become distorted when unanswered questions are filled with speculation. But temptation is strong. When a suspect is identified decades later, people naturally want to reconstruct every missing moment. But responsible investigation must separate what is proven from what remains unknown. In Christina's case, the strongest conclusion came from the DNA. The biological evidence connected Hoover to the crime. Beyond that, investigators had to be careful. His identity could be established. His motive could not necessarily be reconstructed. His thoughts could not be recovered. His confession could not be obtained. The case could be solved in a forensic sense while remaining incomplete in a human sense. That distinction also protected Christine's story from becoming another narrative built on assumptions. The original investigation had shown the danger of allowing theories to become facts. Investigators once believed Moran was responsible. The theory became increasingly powerful. Evidence was interpreted in its favor. The eventual DNA exclusion proved how dangerous that process had been. The final investigation followed a different path. It began with a biological fact and moved outward. The DNA profile came first. Genetic relationships produced leads. Historical information narrowed the field. A preserved blood sample provided confirmation. The direction was reversed. Instead of choosing a suspect and looking for evidence, investigators followed evidence toward a suspect. That difference is one of the most important lessons in the case. It demonstrates why modern cold case investigations often begin by returning to the original physical evidence rather than simply reviewing old witness statements. Witnesses can forget. Memories can change. People can become influenced by media reports, but biological evidence can remain stable. The evidence from Christine's case had survived the years when human recollection was becoming less reliable. The forensic profile had remained the same while the people around it aged. That endurance allowed a new generation of investigators to approach the case without being bound entirely by the assumptions of 1984. The identification of Hoover also changed the meaning of the wrongful conviction. Before the breakthrough, the story could be described as a case in which DNA proved Moran innocent, but the real killer remained unknown. After the breakthrough, there was a second conclusion. The biological evidence had now been connected to another individual. That meant the original investigation had not merely failed to prove Moran's guilt. It had focused on the wrong person while the actual source of the biological evidence remained unidentified. The implications were enormous. An innocent man had been convicted while the real offender remained beyond the reach of investigators. The consequences of tunnel vision were therefore not theoretical. They were measurable. Moran lost years. Christine's family lost years